Hello. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Testing, testing, 1 2 1 2. Can you hear me? Let's find out. No one's saying they can hear me, so that's not necessarily a good sign. Ah, good, right. Yes, welcome to the echo. People are saying, okay. Well, I'll move that around here then. Rightio. So, hi everyone. It is time once again for the Patreon Alternate History live stream followed by live questions. And, well, sorry for the delay. This should have been towards the beginning of the month, but I've been incredibly busy working on working on videos for being away to Australia. So I'm almost there. I think maybe by the end of the week, if I work over the weekend, I'll have everything done and uploaded. But of course, there have been a few minor interferences going on in the time. Yeah, that's including things like the whole issue with the intros. And yes, people have noticed the red alert lighting. So I put some light arrays in the background because, well, if I turn them off, my my library is a little bit dull. So if I turn them back on, then I'm at red alert. But if people prefer, I can just have bright lighting. I can have green lighting. Or I can have blue lighting. Who knows? So people saying put the mic slightly back. Okay, I will do that then. So yeah, we can play around with the lights, but my default is red, so I'm going to leave that at red for the minute. Maybe I'll do a poll later on. Right. So just going to catch up with one or two questions quickly before we launch into the alternate history ones. So Galdar Ioni, the Homeworld Mothership, that came from the Homeworld Remastered Edition. It actually does light up if I could find the power cable for it. So, yeah. The mic is a Blue Yeti. So, I actually have the more advanced version, but annoyingly, the Blue Yeti between the standard one and the latest one has gone from micro USB to mini USB. I think that's the way around it's gone. But basically, I have a really long, good quality micro USB audio cable that reaches all the way back to the PC, and I don't have a similar one that's mini USB. So at the moment, I can't actually use the slightly better microphone, which is a bit annoying. Nonetheless, we are here. I have a drink, and we have 25 alternate history questions before going into questions from chat. So, starting off with Salamin Shakia 93's question. He said, if for some inexplicable reason Britain did not return the Dutch East Indies to the Dutch after the Napoleonic Wars, and there are no major repercussions, and this eventually results in bringing the whole of what is now modern-day Indonesia into the British Empire, what kind of naval forces, ideally on one hand and realistically on the other, would the British maintain in the region throughout the years until the late 1940s, assuming that they managed to hold on to the region until then? How would the other powers react to this force, and what kind of naval and strategic consequences would this cause in this alternate history? So, I mean, unfortunately, the Netherlands are a bit stuffed because their biggest single colonial holding is not there. On the other hand, they can save a bunch of money because they don't have to build naval forces to go and protect it. Britain does. But it does put Britain in a rather interesting situation because they have the big holding that is India, that they're constantly worried about Russia coming down from the north to invade. They have their holdings in Hong Kong and Singapore, which historically are kind of the linchpins, at least in the latter part of the period the channel covers. You've also got Australia and New Zealand. And obviously, historically, previously, you'd have India and Australia, the two big subcontinents, and then Singapore and Hong Kong kind of vaguely in the middle, but nothing really else connecting them as far as British holdings went. If you've got the entirety of what's now Indonesia, that puts the front line, if you like, somewhat further forward, because remember, the Australians, back when Australia wasn't even a thing, when it was the various individual states, they started to buy warships to defend against a potential attack from mostly Russian interests. They thought maybe the French might have a go as well, but they were mostly worried about the Russians. And as we said earlier, they were worried about India being invaded by Russia from the north. Whereas Indonesia obviously being somewhat further north in the Western Pacific. Now that's going to be, if there's going to be a confrontation, that's going to be where it occurs. So suddenly Singapore, which is in a position to, or Hong Kong, which are in positions to launch fleets to intercept incoming attacks, now are actually out of position. Theoretically, they're in a decent location to go to all 3 points, but if somebody's going after Indonesia, or I guess at that point we call the British East Indies, then potentially they might not get there in time. So Singapore and Hong Kong will probably still remain important, but the ports that we see the Dutch using historically, will at least one of them will probably become a fairly major Royal Navy base. And of course, with more territory in the region, the Royal Navy is going to need more forces in the region. The China station historically was varied in strength. Sometimes there were everything up to several battleships, sometimes it was just a handful of cruisers, and everything in between. I think what you're probably going to end up with is maybe a 50 to 100% increase in the forces the Royal Navy typically deployed in that area. And that may well become even more important once oil becomes a major issue, because of course the Dutch East Indies is a major exporter of oil in the early 20th century. It's one of the reasons the Japanese wanted it. And in some ways that might persuade the Japanese to become even better allies with the British, because if they have the Anglo-Japanese alliance as they did historically, then they get favourable access to a very close-by source of oil. Which will simultaneously also make the US ever more determined to break up that alliance come the Washington Naval Treaty, and of course it means that it's now British territory that's ground zero for the Japanese advance instead of Dutch in World War II. There's not really any other major naval powers in the area apart from Japan later on to react to the British having a greater force in the Western Pacific. But it could lead to one other kind of interesting variation, which is that if the British are significantly more committed to the Western Pacific, then that means there's now 3 players on the field once you get to the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So historically, you have the US and Japan as the big players in the game. The British are obviously big players on a global stage, but because their major outposts in the area tend to be, as we said, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Australia, they kind of look at the Pacific on the edges, on the peripheries, but they're not too concerned with watching the two square off, especially once they've got the Anglo-Japanese Naval Treaty going in. In this scenario, with significantly more forces and significantly more British-held territory in the area, the US might be in significantly more tension with the British as well, because obviously both the Japanese and the Americans want the Pacific to be under their nominal control, and Britain is a third spanner in that particular wheel, which whoever's not allied with them is going to find very irritating. What effect that's going to have further on, I'm not entirely sure, but you know that tension between Britain and the States could be a significant factor. So, yeah, I'm just... Thing is, that anything else is... You start to get into very speculative territory. Oh, I suppose the only other thing is, if the British have the Dutch East Indies and they discover oil relatively early, that might inspire them to switch over to oil-fired ships somewhat earlier, because they now have a secure-ish internal source of oil that historically they didn't. But that depends on when, where, and how they're discovering the oil. Computer library on. Computer library on.
Okay.
Sorry, that's sunset is set. Well, the sun is setting, so I have to turn on the internal light here. Right, so moving on to the next question. Oh, I noticed someone... I noticed something. Where was it? There was something in the chat I noticed I wanted to say hello to. Italian Military Archives, there you are. Hello. And Colin Cameron asking, regarding the first question, do you think one of the consequences could be the Washington Treaty being scuppered by the UK refusing the no fortification section to protect the oil? I don't think it would scupper it. It would make it a lot more difficult to negotiate. I think it would also depend on how much fortification was already there, because remember, historically Britain negotiated an exception for Singapore. That was the boundary. So either they would just put a bunch of fortifications in there already if they had thought they had to protect the oil already, so they might be happy with those and just have a clause that says they can upgrade existing but not build new, or they might just say, well, this is now the boundary that we're prepared to negotiate, i.e. we can upgrade the British East Indies, but we won't upgrade any further in. I mean, historically, the British weren't too fussed about that clause because they didn't really have much in the Pacific. But there you go. So the next one, Jim Smitty. During the interwar period, the US Marine Corps and the US Navy are giving enough money to work on both offensive and defensive amphibious operations. Are given, I think that should be. From their wargaming, they see that fixed fortifications have the flaw that they can only be in one place, and a hostile force can just land elsewhere. So this leads to the creation of a heavy tank battalion within the US Marine Corps in the mid-1930s. Congress is happy to fund this as it creates jobs in all their districts. So following the letter of the Washington Naval Treaty, they do not create fortifications on Wake or Guam. Instead, they are reinforced with Marines equipped with heavy armour. What kind of damage could the Marines do to the Japanese had they have heavy tanks mounting 3-inch guns and mobile dismounted 6-inch guns from old battleships against the Japanese landings in December 1941? Well, you can kind of take a cue from the damage they did do with the few guns they did have available, particularly in the defence of Wake Island. If they have more, I think the mobile dismounted 6-inchers are going to be considerably more useful than the 3-inchers in the tanks, because 3 inches, 100-ish, 105 millimeters, I think. I mean, a 1930s heavy tank carrying a gun that size is almost certainly going to be a fixed gun, or it's going to be monstrously large and slow. And if it has somehow worked out how to put a turret on the thing, that's going to probably have a relatively slow reload as opposed to a much more open mobile gun. At which point the tanks would actually probably make much easier targets than the mobile guns, which can be concealed, put in revetments, and moved around probably considerably faster and more easily than the tanks can. Yeah, that's Peter A. Dawson asks, can I play Sunset? It's not quite Sunset, it's just the lights going at the moment. And I honestly have zero idea how to play separate audio on this, on XSplit, unfortunately. Maybe that's something I can look into for the next time. So yeah, I don't think the heavy tanks will be all that useful, except maybe once the landings themselves take place. Once the landings begin, once troops are ashore, having some big, very slow box of armoured steel with a 3-inch gun and presumably a bunch of machine guns will probably be quite useful to take out Japanese soldiers. But those old battleship 6 inches are probably going to do the majority of the damage to the Japanese landings. Will they completely stop them? I don't think so, because the historical Japanese forces they eventually had in that area are still capable of overwhelming them. But they might stop the first or second or maybe even third attack waves cold or with massive casualties. That could have a rather interesting effect on future Japanese operations if they're, 1942, well, late 41, early 42 landing paradigm shows itself to be even more of a bloodbath than it historically was. And who knows? I mean, you might be able to hold off long enough to get reinforcements. It really depends if the US Navy is prepared to send in the reinforcements or whether they turn back because of the strength of the Japanese forces in the area. Nicholas Rassar asks, if USS North Carolina doesn't take a torpedo at Eastern Solomons, presuming that's when you're talking about when she gets hit alongside Wasp, would she go into the second night battle at Guadalcanal with Washington and South Dakota, and if so, to what effect? Yes, she probably would go into the second night action of Guadalcanal, but she probably won't go in with Washington and South Dakota. She'll probably go in instead of South Dakota. Because, remember, South Dakota was a very, very new ship at the time. She was having some temperamental issues with her systems even before the massive radar and electronic cascade failure that she had during the action itself. And South Dakota had received damage earlier in one of the carrier battles, which had disabled at least one of her 16-inch guns, potentially more, depending on who you believed at the time. Therefore, if Halsey has the option of 3 fast battleships, I don't think he's going to send all 3 fast battleships in on that action. So I think he will probably send the 2 that are actually fully functional, which will be Washington and North Carolina, and keep South Dakota to ride escort. It's possible that he might send all 3 in, but sending 3 battleships in with 4 destroyers as escort, that's chancing your arm a lot, especially considering that now represents the entirety of the US fast battleship force. So, personally, I don't think that's completely likely, but in either case, North Carolina, I think, does go in. It's just whether or not South Dakota tags along as well. Right. Then we have... Oh boy, this is a big one. Right, so this is Cone Lead, who has... But basically... Okay, that's... Okay, I'm going to come back to that one. That's going to be one of the 2 end questions, because that is an absolutely massive question. Hi Bacon Bomb asks, if the Soviet naval projects were able to be completed, how would the Soviets fare against the Germans, Italians and Japanese if Operation Unthinkable were to occur? And if Operation Unthinkable were to occur, how would they fare against the US and the UK? I suppose you mean if all the uncompleted Soviet naval projects were able to be completed. Well, in terms of their larger vessels, the Soviets didn't have that many naval projects uncompleted at the time of... Sorry, someone's sending me a message. At the time of the outbreak of World War II, the Sovietsky Soyuz class weren't supposed to be completed by 1939. They were still under construction. I suppose there would be some additional cruisers completed, and if they'd kept building the Chapayevs, that might have helped them a little bit. But broadly speaking, the Soviet naval projects that were supposed to really, really strengthen the Soviet Navy, they were mostly ongoing at the time that war breaks out, as far as the USSR is concerned. So the main thing would be, if, I guess in the spirit of the question, if they're completed, i.e. they are somehow magically completed on their approximate completion schedule during the Second World War, well, the Soviets only fight the Japanese for, the equivalent of about 50 seconds at the end of the war. Against the Italians, the Soviets aren't getting out of the Black Sea, so it doesn't really matter. Against the Germans, unfortunately, it really depends on what the Luftwaffe has to say about this. I mean, if they get a Sovietsky Soyuz or two out into the Baltic completed towards the end of the war, then that could wreak some rather merry hell against the Germans when it comes to the fact they're using the Hippers and Deutschlands as fire support for their troops as they're in retreat. So as long as the Soviet Air Force can keep the Sovietsky Soyuz or two covered, the Soviets could have surface naval dominance during the latter stages of World War II in the Baltic. But that's very, very dependent on A, the Luftwaffe not going after them in a big way, and B, the U-boats not going after them in a big way. And to be honest, in that environment, even E-boats, i.e. S-boats, might have a crack at them. Now, if Operation Unthinkable were to occur, that's obviously after the end of World War II. That means there's considerably more Soviet vessels in service, if we're assuming magical completion during the Second World War. But I don't think it's going to stand them in all that much stead, because even with the Soviet naval projects that they wanted to do and weren't able to do, the Royal Navy and the US Navy are far, 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 far larger. And they have quite a lot of experience at this point in how to attack shipping in confined waters with, well, submarines, surface ships, and aircraft carriers. So although the Soviet Navy would be a bit more of a challenge than it would be in a normal historical alternate timeline Operation Unthinkable, you've also got things like Highball and the early generation of air-to-surface guided weapons, BAT, I think it's BAT for the US and so forth. So I don't think the Soviet Navy would be much for this world, even in this scenario. People pointing out 75 mil is 3-inch. Yeah, that's fair enough. I don't know why. I don't know what I was thinking with the 100 mil, but anyway. Yeah, I should probably put my phone on silent. Right. Just copying out some of the super chats. 2 seconds, I got a voice message from Mrs. Drack.
On our way back, but I had to tell you this because it was absolutely hilarious. You know the barley when it's
That's alright, she's fine. She's just walking floppy. Right. Where were we? Goose Riesbos asks, due to time warp shenanigans, your entire video catalogue, as of time of recording this, is sent to Admiral Fisher in 1904 and Sir Charles Madden in 1929, when they were first Sea Lord, i.e. 10 years before World War I and World War II respectively. Who of the two would benefit the most with all this information in preparation for World War One and World War Two, respectively? That's a difficult one. I genuinely don't know. Because, you see, well, Fisher in 1904 means he can avoid the terribleness that is the Indefatigables. And in theory, he can also lay in instructions to investigate and solve the issues, well, with British shells and with the various issues that British battlecruisers had at Jutland. And, I mean, he will also foresee his, because we've got the videos on Admiral Fisher, he can also foresee his own downfall and work to avoid that, which will then mean he'll be able to address the battlecruiser issues. Which means that theoretically when Jutland occurs, you might have a Jutland where the Indefatigables are actually prototype Lions, the British battle cruisers don't randomly explode constantly, and their gunnery is also somewhat better because he would have been informed of that being a problem, and the British armour-piercing shells work, so all those hits they scored on the German ships that didn't do all that much will probably do an awful lot more. Now, of course, you then open the very wide scenario where you've got you've got, sorry, some people saying they heard Mrs. Drack despite the fact I had the mic muted. Interesting. Okay, I wonder what mic source this is actually taking it from then. What is... default microphone? Weird. Anyway, yeah, you've kind of opened up the question of what happens with a decisive British victory at Jutland. That's a a butterfly flap that is massively speculated on, but really difficult to actually predict. Sapper Ninja pointing out, yeah, we might get the small tube Queen Elizabeths, very very much so, because he's informed of that as well. But then you've flip it to World War II, and there's a lot of potential benefits there. I mean, you can avoid losing Courageous, you can avoid losing Glorious. In 1929, you can even avoid the situation that you can avoid the engineering situation that led to Ark Royal being vulnerable to being sunk. You can get the message that you should probably refit Hood, so hopefully it has a better chance against Bismarck. You can foresee the treaty system collapsing, so you could build the King George V with brand new triple 15s and potentially start retrofitting those newer 15s into the older ships. The thing is, there's so much we've covered so much about World War One and World War Two that I genuinely don't know who would benefit the most with all that information. The only thing is, I would maybe, because World War One is such a... Oh, the thing is that with World War One, you've also got the U-boats. We've highlighted those issues, so they prevent a lot of sinkings by U-boats. I was going to say World War Two, maybe because there's so much more granular examination of battles and technology that we've done for that compared to World War One, but actually the U-boat thing is huge. So I genuinely don't know who would get the more advantage. Dave H pointing out, if the British had passed on the information to the US Navy, then yeah, they could have fixed their torpedoes in the beginning of World War II. That would have made a fun difference. The Judge 2017 asks, late in 1941, Japan continues to push into the Southern Pacific and Singapore, drawing the British into the war. America, for the moment, remains neutral as Japan does not attack. Okay, so we're assuming a no Pearl Harbor scenario. And no Philippines scenario as well. Can the British outbuild the Japanese, and how does this war play out? Can the British outbuild the Japanese? Yes, absolutely they can. Britain's industrial capacity is far greater, especially when it comes to naval construction, than the Japanese capacity is. However, with America remaining neutral, Britain is going to be locally outnumbered because they still have to fight Italy and Germany, and presumably with America still remaining neutral, that means you also don't get things like Ranger, Washington, etc., coming to help with the Arctic convoys and so on, or Operation Torch and so on and so forth. So whilst the British can, in absolute terms, outbuild the Japanese, they won't have a superiority of numbers in the Western Pacific theatre whilst they're fighting in Europe. If the US gets involved at a later date, or if somehow the British manage to resolve the situation in Europe in some way, shape or form that frees up a majority of the Royal Navy, then they can come out and play against the Japanese in a way that the Japanese really can't cope with. But that is going to be much, much later, and also, frankly, will have the British pretty much on the economic ropes if they've had to sustain a European war for several years completely alone, on top of what they were doing historically, and now having to basically fight the Pacific all on their own. I mean, Japan's economy will die first, but it's not going to be pretty. A madman saying, if the British saw the treaties collapsing, wouldn't you for 18-inch guns? No, because you're still within the realms of the escalator clause. The King George V being designed even pre-Second London have to fit 35,000 ton and 16-inch limit, so they can do 35,000 ton and 15. But you have to wait for the escalator clauses in the late 1930s to really get going on the bigger ships. Shiroi Ukami21 says a video about introductory book recommendations isn't in the book recommendation playlist like the other Navy's done so far. Which video is not in the playlist? Well, if someone can tell me which of the introductory book recommendations is not in the playlist for book recommendations, then I will put it in that playlist. But there's a few. Oh yeah. Classe Cornate says, I'd like to see the face you make when I tell you that my favourite drink is Guinness chased by an equal amount of orange juice. Okay. I guess that has to be somebody's favourite drink. I mean, I haven't drunk a huge amount of Guinness generally, to be perfectly honest, but I mean, I can somewhat see the appeal, considering that lemonade following beer or cider tastes extra sweet, but yeah, okay. For those of you who are posting questions in the chat, obviously I will try and get to those, but I'm going through the alternate history Patreon questions first, so questions posted in the chat right now might be a little bit harder for me to pick up later, so just try and bear those in mind. You may want to repeat them once I get to the end of the alt his stuff, which we're almost halfway through, actually. Gregory Albert asks, with Habakkuk levels of displacement, how would you go about combining the best attributes of each navy into a single class of battleships, minimum of 3 in the class? So let me just double check the displacement of Habakkuk. I mean, okay. The final displacement of the ultimate Habakkuk would have been in the millions of tons, I think, if I'm getting this right. Let me just double check that. Yeah, about, well, over 2 million tons. Well, over 2 million tons, that's, I mean, a minimum of 3? So you're talking about battleships weighing about 650,000 tons apiece? I mean, I think there was some crazy Japanese idea for that, but I don't think anyone physically can. I mean, I don't even know how you'd go about even starting. I mean, 2 million tons, even at the absolute insane levels of the British 1945 designs, where you have the 1,000-foot, 100,000-ton battleship with a foot-thick deck armor. Even that, you'd be able to build over 20 of them. So at that point, if you're... I mean, Habakkuk levels of displacement is essentially infinite levels of displacement as far as building a single class of battleships might go. So, I mean, if you were going to combine the best attributes of each navy into a single class of battleship, what would you do? I mean, you'd take probably... I think you'd probably take the British armour formula combined with either Italian or American quality control for your armour. The drive mechanisms, your engines are probably... Well, actually, no. Well, if you really want to go absolute best, then your drive mechanisms for power density are going to actually be the French forced circulation boilers, along with French quad turret technology, but paired to, say, 16-inch 50 caliber guns, and then 5-inch 38s and Mark 37 fire control directors for your anti-aircraft defense. I would combine Bofors and pom-poms for the AA defense, purely because the pom-pom is better against kamikazes. So that's your anti-aircraft firepower, that's your secondary and primary batteries, that's your armor, that's your propulsion. Yeah, I think that would be the best combination of technologies. Some people are saying, US high pressure boilers would be my second choice, but the French forced circulation boilers allow you to get absolutely ridiculous amounts of power out of relatively small footprints. They are a little bit heavy, but if you're talking about shortening up your citadel or within a certain amount of square footage getting a huge amount of power output, then actually the French boilers are a little bit more power dense per square foot. Michael Griffith asks, I would like to suggest that you not convert units of measurement, i.e. if a navy uses imperial, use imperial, and if they use metric, then use metric, as I enjoy the challenge of calculating them in my head. And if people don't want to do that, then there's always Google. I mean, I can kind of see the point. I think, at least for the main armament, I think I'm definitely going to stick with converting if necessary, because it gives people a good idea, ballpark, of where everything goes. For the secondary armament and for the AA armament, it probably doesn't matter too much. And to be honest, once you get down to, sub 4-inch, then the exact calibers are more a function of how good are they at anti-aircraft fire for the most part. Galdir Yonai says, you're sounding like a robot again. I hope I'm not. I don't know why I would be. Packer 910 asks if, although it's slightly outside the Channel time period, the ship itself is within the Channel time period, so please indulge me. Okay, fine. If ARA General Belgrano had not had its fateful encounter with HMS Conqueror, would it actually have posed a risk to the British fleet? I realise it was loaded with a lot of 6-inch guns, but did it outclass the UK surface combatants to a great extent? Yes, Belgrano was sunk because it posed a risk, and it's not just that it proposed a risk, it also had escorts, and I believe at least some of the Argentine ships had surface-launched Exocet, although don't quote me on that, because obviously Falklands is not my speciality. But the general threat assessment that the British had done was that if Belgrano got within surface gun range, then it could be a major problem, because of course the British ships for the most part had 1 or 2 4.5-inch guns, which as an ex-US cruiser, the ex-USS Phoenix, the Belgrano was armoured against in its vital areas, and taking out unarmoured destroyers and frigates is very, very easy for 15 rapid-fire 6-inch guns. So yeah, there was a serious concern that if it got in close, it could do a lot of damage to some very important ships before it went down. Now, to be fair, there was a backup plan if the submarines didn't get it. The absurdly, hilariously named Captain Coward, who definitely wasn't one, actually had this plan of taking a contingent of the British destroyers and frigates to confront it in a surface gun action. And you might be saying, well, Drac, hang on a minute, we just established that wouldn't work because it's 4.5-inch guns. Yeah, it wouldn't work to sink Belgrano, but the plan was to saturate Belgrano in rapid-fire radar-directed 4.5-inch fire and hope that it broke things like Belgrano's own radar and other fire control systems, which would leave it somewhat blind. And then British ships at the time, at least some of them, had their own surface-launched Exocets, which they would then use to try and finish off the Belgrano. But it was going to really cause a major problem. Duke of Betchington saying Belgrano did have Exocets, right. Problem? Testing, 1 2 1 2. Tim Moore asking, while I'm waiting for a reply on the testing, Tim Moore asking, did the US Navy ever have a triple-deck gun ship like HMS Victory in the Age of Sail? Yes, USS Pennsylvania. Their one and only first-rate ship of the line. Okay, fixed. Apparently I just needed to literally switch it on, off and on again. I don't know what's going on with that. Okay, well, note to self, make sure to get the mini USB extended audio cable. In fact, let me just put that on a list. Okay, I have that on my list of things to go. Vicky, no, Pennsylvania was a 3-decker. She did have guns on the upper deck, but that's an open deck. So as far as ships' gun decks are concerned, those don't count as part of the gun. They don't count as a continuous covered gun deck. I mean, the same thing with HMS Victory. Her carronades were on the upper deck, so although that's a 4th level of guns, it doesn't make Victory a 4-decker. Richard Goss asks, say budget was no limit and you are asked to design a warship of any class for specific theatres of action, Mediterranean, Pacific and Atlantic. What would you build for the Royal Navy and German Navy of World War One? I mean, you don't really want to be building things for specific theatres of action because you're going to end up compromising what you could do in others. But assuming that for some reason you absolutely had to, if you take the classic speed, protection, firepower paradigms, well, speed, speed is useful in all of these, but an element of the propulsion which is related to speed is range. If you're designing a ship for specifically the Mediterranean, you can get away with less range, which frees up displacement to do other things. If you're designing a ship for the Pacific, you have to do considerably more range than anywhere else, and the Atlantic is the middle case. Protection-wise, I mean, obviously destroyers generally don't have protection, but in World War One, yeah, you do. The thing is, if you're designing Mediterranean, Pacific, Atlantic for the Royal Navy in Germany, they're mostly going to be encountering smaller ships, merchant raiders, cruisers, etc. So protection is going to be much of a muchness across the board. Firepower, however, in the more distant climes, you have a bit of a issue in that you will be less supported by capital ships, which might make you want bigger guns, but also you're less likely to come across bigger ships, which might make you want many smaller guns. But looking at historically, I think in the Pacific, you probably want a long-range ship that's more armed more along the lines of an armoured cruiser, i.e. some fairly big guns to help look after itself, plus smaller ones which can deal with smaller stuff like raiders. In the Atlantic, you're probably looking something more like a fleet support vessel, so probably more numerous guns, maybe slightly less protection because you're riding with a fleet, and likewise with the Mediterranean. So something approximating the later German protected cruisers, the British World War I towns, would be good for the Atlantic. The Mediterranean, you're probably looking at fast scout cruisers, and the Pacific, you're looking at more like bigger armoured cruisers. But to pull off very, very specific designs, then that's going to be a lot more of an involved question. Lord Quack, King of the Ducks, asks, the US was very isolationist in the run-up to World War II. What if Germany hadn't declared war on the US after Pearl Harbor and Roosevelt politically wasn't able to do anything other than beef up Lend-Lease in the European theatre? The gut instinct is to say that the US beats Japan faster, but given the poor performance of early US fleets, would having all the extra ships in theatre earlier just result in more losses? It's also doubtful the USS Robin, aka HMS Victoria's deal would have happened in that case. How do you see the naval war for both theatres playing out? Well, Operation Torch is going to have a few issues, considering you don't have Ranger and the Sangamons and all the other US support, including Massachusetts, to pull it off. And with that, you also don't have forces advancing from the western part of North Africa. I mean, in the Pacific, the US doesn't really want to put Ranger in the Pacific anyway, so that's not really a huge change. They'd have more destroyers available because they wouldn't be running escorts, etc. in the Atlantic. So that would strengthen up US escort formations a little bit more. Same thing with cruisers, so that's good, especially for the early actions for Guadalcanal. The battleships tended to use the Arctic convoys as a kind of extended working up exercise anyway. So outside of the Guadalcanal campaign, I don't think it's going to change 1942 that much. Coral Sea, Midway, etc. pretty much are going to be as per history. And then, Guadalcanal, having more ships available in the cruiser and destroyer terms might be good. It might just mean the Japanese get more kills early on. If we assume a median case, you might not actually get Admiral Lee going in, which might actually end up much, much worse, because if you have more cruisers and destroyers available, then after the first big action at night against Hiei and Kirishima, you might actually have enough cruisers and destroyers left over in theater to send in again, at which point they run into Kirishima and friends, which will probably end less well for the US Navy than it did historically, weirdly enough. But simultaneously, you might have a little bit less damage to some of the carriers because you have more escorts firing more anti-aircraft rounds. Which in turn means that in theory you have slightly more or slightly more intact ships going into the latter part, at which point the US rolls Japan ever so slightly faster, albeit I don't think it shortens the war all that much, because you would be looking at still a preparation for the land invasion of Japan. That's not going to be advanced hugely by this change at the beginning of the war, and then atomic bombs come in and cut short that whole thing. Anyway, the naval war in the Atlantic and in Europe playing out is going to be very, very different, though, because without US support for the landings in Italy, they probably don't go ahead. As I said, Operation Torch probably doesn't go ahead. The Arctic convoys get much harder to secure. I think generally speaking, if the US is unable to enter the war in Europe, about the only thing that's going to be positive for the Royal Navy would be that they're almost certainly not going to send Prince of Wales and Repulse, and most of the British forces for ABDA Command, and for the Eastern Fleet, Warspite VRs, the carriers that were pulled over to there, all of that, probably most of that isn't going to be sent, because if the US is dealing with the Pacific alone and the British have no reinforcement or help in the Atlantic European theatre, they're going to be keeping everything they possibly can as close to home as possible. So the Eastern Fleet is basically going to be made up of just whatever they think is necessary to try and secure Sri Lanka, India, Australia, and that's mostly working on the tyranny of distance, working against the Japanese. But that it's going to make the Royal Navy very much more stretched in Europe, even being able to pull those ships back, because not losing those ships in the case of Force Z and the Indian Ocean raid, that's not going to make up for the amount of US ships that showed up in theatre in the last part of the war. Salty Viking 10,022. Okay, that's a question I'm going to have to answer in a actual dry dock, because that's a very extensive one that's going to require pictures. So I'm going to put that there. That's that really long one. John Edward Dietz asks, what would the world's navies have looked like if everyone had independently come to the conclusion that the 5-inch 38 was the best secondary armament and everyone adopted it? I need to get back on that alternate design of Great Eastern. That's the other part of the question. I do need to actually send through the sketch designs. I've completely forgotten about that. Darn. Okay, right. I will need to deal with that. Let me put a note. There we go. Right. Okay. Anyway, what will the world's navies have looked like if everyone had independently come to the conclusion 5-inch 38 is the best and adopted it? Well, given the time that the 5-inch 38 is invented, I mean, the US factories producing the 5-inch 38 are going to be very, very happy. Congress is maybe not going to be quite so happy exporting the US Navy's latest and greatest dual-purpose main gun to all and sundry. I mean, come World War II, that you're going to end up in a very interesting position, because assuming that somehow everybody has adopted it, then of the various major navies, by the time you get to sort of, well, to be honest, the beginning of the war, but also officially 1941, Britain's going to be the only country that'll be getting spare parts and tech support. Germany, Italy, Japan will not be getting the spare parts and the technical support for their guns, which will then lead to a bit of a... It's going to be a bit of an interesting one. Can they reverse engineer and manufacture their own spare parts fast enough to keep their 5-inch 38s operating, or will they break down? And will they have to then be replaced by native guns, which they will therefore have spent less time developing? For the Royal Navy, being able to kind of standardise on the 5-inch 38 would be a great relief to, Royal Navy officers having to work out which version of the 4.7 or 4.5 they're supposed to be sending supplies out to now. But it also depends on how easily the 5-inch 38 can be refitted. You've got destroyers that are already being constructed with 4.7-inch guns. Weight-wise, I don't see much of a problem swapping those out for 5-inch 38s, but cost-wise, time-wise, etc., could they do that? That's a bit of a problem. Matthias is here. Hello. So the 5-inch 38. I mean, the funny thing is, if the 5-inch 38 is adopted universally, it actually makes the war go easier, I think, for the Allies, because the Axis 5-inch 38s all break down. As I said, unless they manage to reverse engineer them all. Excelsior 1. It's a long one. So apparently I am the owner of a shipyard and foundry, and I can see Portsmouth. I mostly build commercial vessels. Drydock and slipway to build a heavy cruiser. No advanced knowledge or hindsight other than your forward-thinking and progressive ideas. You have to stick by all current treaties, so what's your plan? Okay, trademark Drac cruiser, heavy cruiser. Talking about current treaties, so that's presumably the interwar period. Right, so I'm building a heavy cruiser. Well, you know where this is. You almost certainly know where this is going. It's going to have an all-forward armament. Now, do I do an all-forward 888 Nelson-style armament, or do I do an all-forward Richelieu-Dunkirk double quad all-forward armament? Now, given that I'm playing with 10,000 tons, we know how limiting that is. I think a trademark Drac cruiser, heavy cruiser of this, the interwar period, let's say 1930, early 1930s, I'm probably going to go with a pair of quad 8-inch up front, and then numerous, if it's earlier, numerous twin 4s. If it's slightly later, numerous twin 4.5s as the secondaries. Probably, let's say, 3 twin mounts on either side, and then a couple of super firing twin 4.5s or twin 4s aft. So that gives me a 10 gun anti-aircraft broadside, which actually means I have a similar heavy anti-aircraft broadside to most capital ships. I can stick some pom-poms in there as well, because obviously it's being built in Britain. Couple of quad torpedo launchers, probably in the aft break between the amidships run of 4s and probably 33 knots, and What can we do? I'm just trying to think, but protection-wise, I think protection-wise you could probably get a 6-inch armour in on that with the space and weight savings from the quad 8s all up forward. Yeah, okay. I mean, I'd be tempted to jump into Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts and build that now, except for the fact I'd have to work out how to actually stream that, which I don't know how to do. David S. Cameron, yeah, I believe you mentioned HMS Celandine before. I am in the process of trying to do some research on that, but it means I need to get to the archives, which is probably not going to be after I get back from Australia, but it definitely is on my list of things to try and work out. In fact, let's... Okay, yeah, no, I'm not going to launch Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts. Stop it, Drac. But I will build a Drac cruiser maybe and show it in a later Drydock and put another note. Build a Drac treaty heavy cruiser. Right. Alright, back we go. Someone says the Ultimate Admiral Dreadnought has no quad 8-inch. Boo! Also hiss. French Navy is missing from the playlist. Right, okay. I will quickly fix that problem. Right. There we go. French Navy Introductory Book Recommendations is now in the Book Recommendations playlist. I'll come back to that, Grey Ghost, if you can remember to ask me afterwards, but we are forging through. That's... Okay, 1, 2, 3. We have 7 questions and then the long 2 questions, so let's get on to those. Right, Randwick 78. It's a Mediterranean theatre alternate history. Assuming the Axis Pact is complete in 1935, the Germans come to Italy with a proposal. They'd like to build 3 of their newly designed Bismarck-class battleships at a time, but they only have the capacity to build 2. They would like to have the third constructed in Italian shipyards, and in addition to payment, they're sharing technologies used in the Bismarck's class, which will be made available to the Italians. Aside from the guns, fire control and ammunition, which will be manufactured in Germany and transported to Italy, all other systems and materials will be provided to the Italians using Italian industry and resources. In the event of a war with France, the Kriegsmarine will either deal with or blockade the French in the Atlantic. So the Italians are hesitant. Italians agree anyway, but an Italian Bismarck is laid down in 1936. It's not ready for commissioning until June 1941, at which point joining the Kriegsmarine is not an option. The Germans do, however, send a crew to Italy with instructions to operate both with the Italian fleet in general but they have a license to sortie independently if they believe there's an opportunity to take advantage. How does an Italian Bismarck change the trajectory of the Mediterranean campaign? What changes to the Royal Navy strategy and theatre will be needed to deal with this additional threat? And would the technology transfer of things not like, but not restricted to radar, actually prove to be a greater threat to the Royal Navy than the ship itself? Okay, so yeah, the Germans transferring their radar tech to Italy, given that Italy had given up on their radar in the early part of World War II, that could be a much bigger threat than anything else, because it would at least provide the Italians some ability to see in the dark, even if they don't necessarily have the tactics or strategy or training to use it as well as the Royal Navy does. But it would be a rather significant problem. And the Italians are fairly adaptable, so by sort of 42, 43, they would have worked it out. So that would have significantly reduced the British advantage in night fighting, assuming that the Italians are able to mass produce it, which is another problem entirely. What changes the Royal Navy? The biggest problem, I think, whilst the technology transfer there would be a problem. I mean, Italian fire control is fine. The Italians aren't really going to be changing the Littorio's guns for the Bismarck's guns anytime soon, I don't think. Italian armour is perfectly fine. I don't think they need to learn all that much from the Germans. And even if they wanted to, it's a bit late anyway, in terms of armour plate production for their bigger ships. Propulsion-wise, I mean, the Italians are much better off sticking with their own machinery. But having a third big fast battleship, especially one that's want to go off on its own random charges, that makes things much more difficult for the Royal Navy. In terms of overall capabilities, it's not much more of a problem than having the Littorio and Vittorio Veneto around. But now there's 3 of them. That is a much bigger problem. So again, this is another example of something that might stop Force Z being deployed to the Pacific, because if once 3 fast battleships come online, the Royal Navy is going to want to either permanently station at least Rodney and or Nelson in the area, which means that the King George V will be needed to cover their absence, or the Royal Navy might have to deploy 1, maybe 2 of its own King George V's to the Mediterranean to try and counter a 3 Italian fast battleship formation. So yeah, I mean, it could be very interesting, because it's going to pull the British between pillar and post, because especially with it coming into service in June 1941, I mean, okay, Bismarck's just been dealt with, so that does help, and Tirpitz isn't quite yet online. But Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are still in Brest, so the British are looking at having to have, well, there's, if you've got Littorio, Vittorio Veneto, and this other fast battleship, so there's 3 big fast battleships in the Med, another one coming online in Germany being Tirpitz, and another 2 in Brest. So that means you've got 6, which means that really the British need at least 9 to deal with those overall. Bearing in mind the Germans and the Italians can sail when they want, the British have to be ready for them at all times. So if the Americans are, say, contributing a couple of fast battleships by the end of 41, which they historically do, but before that, you've got Duke of York maybe coming online later in the year, King George V and Prince of Wales available. You're assuming that everything's gone as per historical, so Hood is gone, which means that the British only actually have 2 fast battleships plus Renown and Repulse to deal with potentially up to 6 in different areas. That's quite a bit of a problem. Now, dealing with Scharnhorst and Gneisenau is a little bit easier, because they know that they won't fight pretty much any battleship. So maybe you can think that the slower battleships on convoy escort duty will negate those, but you still need at least 2 to deal with Tirpitz. And now you've still got 3 in the Mediterranean. Yeah, it's struggling to square the circle with that one. The only thing I could suggest is that maybe the only thing that the British can really do at that point is either increase special forces, aerial torpedo, and other fancy attacks to try and cripple one or more of these ships, or potentially. No, that's not going to work. I mean, it would put the British a bit more on the defensive in the Mediterranean, that's for sure. The only other thing would be maybe if it's laid down, if it's laid down in 1936, it might prompt the British to either accelerate the construction of the King George V's or lay down vanguard earlier, just to keep the balance going. But it's a very difficult proposition for them. Rodney McCoy. I realise Exercise Rhine has been covered over and over and over. However, a hypothetical question comes to mind. What if Bismarck were replaced with Graf Zeppelin? It dies very quickly, because if we assume that Bismarck, and we now have Graf Zeppelin sailing with Prince Eugen, then when Hood and Prince of Wales show up, the biggest thing that the Germans have to counter Prince of Wales and Hood, which are very nearly in gun range already, are 8-inch guns. And yes, in theory, Graf Zeppelin could try and launch an airstrike, but they're not going to be keeping a full load of torpedo bombers or dive bombers spotted on deck in North Atlantic weather when they don't need to. And Prince Eugen going, hey, we've heard incoming British capital ships on hydrophones. Between that point and the British capital ships actually churning up and opening fire, I doubt you'd have gotten much, if anything, up on deck, armed, fueled, warmed up, ready to go. And even if you had, it'll be a very scattershot set of attacks, which, okay, you might buy a little bit of time whilst Hood and Prince of Wales evade, but between Norfolk, Suffolk, Hood and Prince of Wales, they're going to catch you and kill you. In fact, if it's Graf Zeppelin and Prince Eugen, Norfolk and Suffolk might have been tempted to have a crack at them as soon as they detected them going in at night to avoid German airstrikes. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harakaze asks, by some miracle of fate, Musashi survives to sail out with her older sister as part of Operation Tengo. Would the strike aircraft from the US carriers have been enough to take them both out, or would the battleships have gone in as well to make certain the job was done? I think the US might have sent the battleships in to finish them off, purely because, there's enough torpedoes and bombs on the US carriers to finish off Yamato Musashi. Okay, that's a definite given. But there are two issues. One, it's the splitting of fire. You know, if they concentrate on one, given how long it took to actually finally finish off Yamato, there may not be enough hours in the day to launch enough strikes to finish off Musashi, and then if Musashi just goes full bore overnight, she may well be crossing that line of we need to intercept this thing with battleships and finish it off, even if the strike aircraft are helping out. If they split, then you may not get enough hits in over the course of the day on any single one. Bearing in mind, obviously, they'll be having mutually supporting anti-aircraft fire as well, for what that's worth, to really, you know, they'll be damaged, but they might not be sinking. So they might be, you know, crippled and then finished off by the battleships along with aircraft. The final thing to consider is that the sinking of Musashi taught the US a lot about how to sink a Yamato. Musashi took an awful long time to go down, whereas with Yamato, they tried at least to mostly target one side to make it roll over, although Yamato was hit on both sides anyway. But it was a lot more uneven than with Musashi. If they didn't go after Musashi historically, or if they did and she survived, and they didn't learn that lesson, then you might have a worst case scenario of the aircraft splitting their attacks between the two battleships and attacking from both sides, at which point both ships might be slowed and waterlogged, but they would be sailing into the night still afloat, at which point, again, the US will probably deploy the battleships along with strike aircraft the following morning to make sure it is absolutely certain that those things are put down. Ramal asking, is this still questions from Patreon? Yes, although not that many left. We've got 4 and then 2 long ones. King Brock, after the First World War, the South American countries of Argentina, Brazil and Chile wanted to continue acquiring dreadnoughts but were unable to. They sent representatives to the Washington Naval Treaty with the goal of being able to get good deals on ships that had to be scrapped or cancelled, and they managed to get an agreement to a limit of 85,000 tons of battleships. Okay. Each country can buy 1 new ship built up to treaty limits, and any ship that had to be scrapped can be sold to them instead. Each of the South American countries wants to get the best ships for the cheapest. Which new ships do they acquire, and which historically scrapped ships are the best buys? How do these ships change World War II? They're probably not going to change World War II all that much, because both the South American countries pretty much stayed out of the war for a fairly long period. Brazil did get stuck in about halfway through, but their primary contribution was troops. And to be perfectly honest, none of the South American dreadnoughts were historically in particularly brilliant shape come World War II. I think Almirante Latorre was in the best shape, but that's not saying much. So I don't think it's going to change World War II at all. But in terms of what new ships do they acquire, Argentina might very well buy the historic USS Washington, the 4th Colorado. They have, I mean, with the Rivadavias, they already have a somewhat closer ties with US shipbuilding, and the Americans have already put a fair bit of resources into building Washington, so they might as well get their some money's worth by completing her and selling her to the Argentinians. The Brazilians and the Chileans, especially the Chileans, are more likely to go to the British, which might extend the Nelsons to a 4-ship run, with each of them buying a Nelson. In terms of historically scrapped vessels, now that's an interesting one, because the Germans, no one's going to want to buy 1 of those, especially considering most of them have been scuttled. So it comes down to what ships do the 2 others have to get rid of. Well, the French and the Italians are still operating pre-dreadnoughts. All their dreadnoughts are still intact. The Japanese have to get rid of the Kawachis, but they are very old, relatively speaking. They're doing 1st-gen dreadnoughts. If they want the absolute best buy from the historically scrapped vessels, again, if you look at the US is keeping its last generation of 12-inch armed ships, and in fact, even the Floridas initially. So at that point, the Orions are probably the best ships that they can grab, because they are the only super dreadnoughts that are getting scrapped, and they're relatively new. They're just over around about a decade old at this point. So yeah, given that Brazil and Chile are already buying from the UK anyway, they'll probably grab an Orion to go with their Nelson, or who knows, they might want a battle cruiser, so maybe somebody buys Princess Royal and somebody buys Lion. The Argentinians, if they keep with buying US, they may buy one of the US 12-inch battleships, just as a package deal with Washington for interoperability. The Vauxhall pointing out, yes, mighty Bolivia declared war on the Germans. Yes, then the mighty Bolivian Navy. Well, I mean, the Bolivians did manage to kill Che Guevara, so they can do something right occasionally. Knight 6831 saying the Royal Navy's 13.5-inch armed ships are a liability. Well, Almirante Latorre is very closely related to them, so there is that. And, well, the unfinished German World War I dreadnought hulls, you'd actually have to finish them, which would mean spending money in terms of building ship money, as opposed to a ship that's already around, which you can just buy. They're not going to... The US wouldn't sell them, New York or Texas, because they need them as part of their fleet for, for the post-Washington world. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, if you were given unlimited funds and a set of suitable locations to host the ships, which 10 to 20 ships would you have full-size replicas built of to commemorate the history of the actual ships or ship types in Drax Museum of Naval History? 10 to 20 full-sized replicas. Oh boy. Now you're asking. Okay. Let's see. 10 to 20 full-sized replicas. I would have... I would have a full-sized replica, because the thing is, there's already the Olympias, there's already a trireme, so I would get whatever a quinquereme looks like once the historians have finished arguing about it. I would have a replica quinquereme to represent the heavy units of the Roman era of naval warfare, and for similar reasons a dromon, complete with Greek fire launchers, which everyone can then argue over what the Greek fire projectors are supposed to have. Likewise, a full-size replica of a Chinese treasure ship, once everyone can stop arguing about what the Chinese treasure ship sizes actually were. I know there's a replica in China, but it's a replica to one specific type of interpretation of the size. What else could we have? From the sort of medieval period, I think I'd like a Japanese warship. Oh, and a Korean turtle ship. Okay, Japanese warship and a Korean turtle ship. That'll make a nice pair, because obviously Admiral Yi sank a lot of one with using some of the other. Then, I mean, there's the Bremen cog. There's a few other medieval cogs, but the big medieval prestige ships. A galleass. Get a galleass replica. A big medieval prestige ship like the Holy Ghost or the Grace Dieu, and similarly a prestige galleon like Henry Grace Adieu or Mary Rose. There's already a Spanish galleon replica out there, so I don't need to worry about that. So we're up to 8. Where are we going after that? Oh, a third-rate ship of the line and Sovereign of the Seas. One of the bigger Dutch capital ships from the Anglo-Dutch Wars, because that's quite unique as a shallow draft vessel. So that's up to 11. Then we've got things like Victory, various frigates, so the Age of Sail and Constitution. So that part of the Age of Sail is mostly already covered. We've got Warrior. I'd get preserve a central battery ironclad of some description, and either Magenta or Solferino, the double-deck French ironclads. Maybe the Italia, the Italian ironclad. At least one big ironclad ram, that's 15. Dreadnought. Yeah, why not have a replica of Hood? Warspite, obviously. Enterprise for a Yorktown-class carrier. And that leaves us with one more. I'm not going to have a... Oh, I'll have a replica of Richelieu, because that looks really nice. People, the Lake Nemi ships. Yeah, the Lake Nemi ship might be a nice one as well. David B., if you've been in charge of the Nagato modernization, What would you have done to increase their combat capability? What was done historically? Did they increase, or was it just increase speed and upgrade belt armor? Full Nagato modernization is a bit difficult. I mean, the guns are fine for their period. There's not really a huge amount you can do to upgrade those. I mean, the Nagatos had a relatively comprehensive modernization, which did up their speed a bit. But if I was going to do a full Nagato modernization and get all singing, all dancing, then you basically have to take a leaf out of the Italian book, except that whereas with the Italian book you are reducing the armament by removing an amidships turret, with the Nagatos, I mean, there's less headroom for increasing the machinery capability because they already have somewhat more modern machinery than the Cavors and Duilios did. But you could maximize that, remove the casement batteries, put in twin 5-inch, which, okay, it's twin Japanese 5-inch, it's not brilliant, but it's better than casement batteries. And then, I mean, you could bulge it and extend the bow. Again, taking a riff off of the Italians to get some buoyancy and speed out of it. By extending the bow, that'll help up your top speed, and the extra buoyancy there might buy you enough to upgrade the belt armor as well. So that would be how I would do it. But you're talking about an ambitious program that's probably equally ambitious, if not more ambitious, than the Italian Cavour upgrades. But, you know, you put me in charge of it, so hey, I've got to bankrupt Japan's economy somehow. Ronin pointing out that they apparently were building a replica of Admiral de Ruyter's flagship in the Netherlands, but the funding ran out, which is a pity. John McDonough links a song called 47 Ginger-Headed Sailors, which I'm going to have to listen to another time because it is apparently very amusing. Right, so that's the shorter Patreon questions out of the way. So we've just got the two big ones, and then we're on to Super Chats, and then we're on to everybody else. Right, so the long question from Coneled. Every ship that the British Navy ever owned and or operated before the commissioning of HMS Dreadnought has magically appeared fully crewed and combat capable in the English Channel. Commanded by an admiral of your choice, also has to be pre-HMS Dreadnought. This includes ships that have launched but have not been commissioned, does not include anything that had not been launched or is still under construction. So that's Force 1. Force 2, World War II ships of your choice from any time during the conflict, magically placed fully crewed and combat capable in the Straits of Dover. Assuming that Force 2's objective is to make it out to the open ocean, so they're running down the English Channel, where it can just outrun everything, what is the minimum size and tonnage of vessels which would be needed to have a decent chance of escaping the situation? Force 1's objective is simply to stop this from happening. Conditions. Force 1's commander can magically issue orders to all of his vessels, so he knows the status and location of all of his vessels at all times, but can only act based on what they can physically see or detect based on their ship's capabilities, so no radar or aircraft, etc. Any of Force 2's ships being sunk or captured is considered a failure. Force 2 may board to recapture one of its own vessels should it be captured in a boarding action. Ammunition and men are not magically replenished, but may be stolen or acquired by things such as boarding actions. The weather is clear in calm seas. Force 2, which is the World War II ships, gets 1 hour to prepare or go to general quarters. This includes things like launching aircraft, should they have such capabilities. They're not allowed to move or fire during this time, but can raise power. Crew in either force are not particularly surprised and will go with it. Force 2 is allowed to be a force from various mixed nations. Okay, right. I'm going to just check something. So we're starting from the Straits of Dover. Okay, so we've got to cover about 330 miles. Okay, right, just checking some equations there. Right, so... I mean, if you want to be really cheesy about it, you could just say that Force 2 is made up of World War II submarines. They dive and they proceed down the English Channel, and there's nothing that that Force 1 can do about it because they have pre-HMS Dreadnought, they have zero capability to detect the submarines. So the submarines win by default. At which point, you know, you could take a U class for really small tonnage. But if we're going with the spirit of it, where this is supposed to be a surface action, I mean, at point blank range, even the, you know, pre-Dreadnought 12-inch guns will do a number on heavy cruisers. So you're going to have to take if you're not going to have anyone sunk or captured, that's going to be, you're going to have to take battleships. Now, the thing is, if they've got to transition the length of the English Channel, that means as long as the ships in question can do 28 knots, they can get there within 12 hours. So that means that Force 2 can sail at night, which is going to massively complicate things for Force 1, although they do have the advantage of, well, if they've got every single warship that the British ever owned or operated prior to HMS Dreadnought, they could literally just wall the channel off into it, like, you know, from the Isle of Wight south, you could just have a solid line of ships, which makes it impossible to work your way through otherwise. At which point, the problem is there aren't that many World War II battleships equipped with torpedoes. I would take a the minimum tonnage. I would take a Yamato class battleship plus a Lexington class aircraft carrier, have them sail in very close formation, sail at night at the maximum speed of the Yamato class, make it a very late war Lexington, well, at that point it's going to be Saratoga, so that she can operate night attack aircraft. And then when those radar-equipped, well, some of their radar search-equipped aircraft detect a solid line of enemy ships blocking the way, then you can drop flares, figure out which ones are the more vulnerable ones, and then launch a torpedo strike, which they're not going to be able to get away from, blow a big hole with your torpedo bombers, and then forge through with Yamato firing left, right, and centre on all sides. And I'm choosing Yamato purely basically on sheer mass and armour thickness, because she can bully her way through, not quite, but almost point-blank range, whilst Lexington is quick, capable of night fighting, and actually has, for a carrier, relatively decent armour, so is probably likely to stand up the best to any incidental shots. And then we have Okage's question. Right, I did look through this before, and he's asking for some sketches as well. So I think I'm going to have to do, I will answer that question, but I don't think I can do it now, because it's about basically further advances on the Dutch-Japanese hybrid that we discussed last time we did a live stream. So given that he wants some sketches and it's a very detailed question, I think I'm probably going to have to do that as a separate small video, maybe a Friday video when I get back from Australia, but it will be done. So that puts us into Super Chat territory. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, about 7 of those, which means we're almost almost to taking questions from everybody else. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 super chat questions. John Hart asks, from 1815 to 1914, in terms of quality, training, and ship numbers, when do you think the Royal Navy was at its weakest state? That's a interesting one. Quality, training, and ship numbers. I think there's different weak points for each of those. I think if you were going to look at ship numbers relative to everybody else in terms of frontline combatants that matter, the Royal Navy is probably at its weakest in the... I'm probably going to say the latter part of the 1880s. In terms of training, I'd probably go with the late 1840s, early 1850s. And in terms of quality, as in their ships relative to everybody else's ships, that's a... Well, they stay ahead mostly in the ironclad race. They stay ahead in the pre-dreadnought race. If you wanted to... If you wanted to poke to a very, very narrow time period for quality, you could maybe go for 1907, 1908, when you've got the Indefatigables and basically several sets of repeat dreadnoughts being built. That's a very, very narrow window. Other than that, so they pretty much stay ahead of everyone else ironclad-wise. Quality. I think maybe the quality would probably be the 1820s, because in the 1820s, a lot of the more recent, more modern Royal Navy vessels had actually been put in ordinary, and that included stuff that had been built right at the very end of the Napoleonic Wars, because the Royal Navy was trying to keep those latest and greatest vessels with the longest lifespan in case of a future conflict. So in the 1820s, the Royal Navy was significantly smaller than it had been during the Napoleonic Wars, and they were running a lot of their older ships, their older and weaker ships, basically to run the clock out on their whole life, and then bringing the newer ships into service afterwards. So yeah, those would be the three places, I think. Rebel Skvirl asks, a question about your USS Arizona video. Had the ship's main magazines been empty on December 7th, 1941? Would damage inflicted on it have sunk it anyway, or would it be afloat and repairable? Well, I don't know if it would have been afloat and repairable by the end, because obviously we don't know what exact damage that bomb would have done had all of the ship's magazines been empty. It wouldn't have done anything good, that's for certain. And we also don't know how much other ordnance would have been chucked to Arizona had she not been blown up. So I wouldn't necessarily swear to saying that she'd be afloat. She almost certainly would be repairable. I mean, West Virginia was repairable, and I severely doubt Arizona would have been in a worse state than West Virginia. But yeah, I don't know if it would have been sunk. Possible. I mean, the hits to Nevada theoretically should not have sunk her, but the state that she was in meant that she did go down, and had to be beached. It's possible that Arizona might end up going to the bottom anyway, but she definitely would be recoverable and repairable. And she'd probably be one of the less damaged. She'd kind of be in the same ballpark as Nevada or California, as opposed to someone like West Virginia. Wojciech Slezak said, here's a little something for Rule the Waves 3. Thank you very much. I will be doing a video on Rule the Waves 3, although it's now looking very much like I'm going to be doing it when I get back from Australia, because time is very rapidly running out and I still have videos to make. Sapper Ninja, the Indian Ocean Raid, alternate history. Indian Ocean Raid makes contact. Royal Navy major units hold off major in Japanese Navy units, whilst Formidable and Indomitable sink the Japanese carriers with guns. Does this alter carrier development going forward? I mean, it is actually a theoretically more plausible scenario than you might think. How would it alter carrier development going forward? It would confuse the heck out of pretty much everybody who had anything to do with carriers. The thing is, if it does go down that way, so we're talking about early 1942, the Essex class are already under construction. The Implacables are already under construction. Unless they suddenly, turn on a dime and start redoing those designs, which I severely doubt they're going to mid-war, the first designs that can really be affected by that are going to be things like the light fleet carriers, but they're not designed to do much in the way of surface stuff anyway. They're supposed to only last a few years, so they're not going to really be affected. But it'll be things like the Maltas, the Audaciouses, the Midways, etc. So there may be some thought to the idea that maybe carriers need to have a bit more side armour. I mean, their dual-purpose guns will be fairly good, so just more of those anyway. The main thing is going to be what happens then with Coral Sea and Midway with Hiryu and Soryu sunk. Because if you get to the end of 1942 and Hiryu, Soryu, and though you've had Midway, so you've got Akagi, Kaga, etc. being sent down, Shoho at Coral Sea, if they've all gone down to airstrikes, then the loss of Hiryu and Soryu to Formidable and Indomitable in a night gun action will be seen as an anomaly and probably won't change things all that much. But if you don't get Coral Sea and Midway and you get only some much grander naval carrier engagement later down the line, then come the end of 42, beginning of 43, you only have maybe two major carrier engagements. One's a surface action and one's a air action. That might have some more effects. But I think, to be honest, the single biggest effect will probably be the idea that carriers need a lot more heavy protection at night, i.e. escorts, rather than, we need to make the carrier a gunship. Captain Charlemagne, why didn't the US Navy use the 1920 South Dakota class guns and turrets, if they still existed, on the North Carolina class when they were switched for 14-inch to 16-inch? Because the turrets didn't exist. The 16-inch guns were all in storage or had been sent over to the army to turn into fortifications. And the 16-inch 50, the Mark II, was a rather large and rather heavy gun, and trying to install that with an appropriate turret on the North Carolina class would have been a significant problem for them. So I'm just going to double check the exact figures, because remember, the North Carolina class are still subject to the treaty requirements of displacement. There's separate issues with saying, right, we're going to build 16-inch ships, and later that we're going to build 40 or 45,000 ton ships. They're not identically, they don't happen at the same time. So the 16-inch 50 from the North Carolinas, from the South Dakota 1920s, that's 128 tons per gun. The 16-inch 45 is 97 tons per gun. Although that's without breach, so maybe let's round it up to 100 tons. So if you're looking at the 16-inch 50s, so just the 9 guns, let alone the turrets, which, as I said, will have to be bigger and therefore heavier, if you're using the 16-inch 50s, that's 1,150 tons odd just of the guns on a 35,000 ton ship. Whereas if you're using and we've rounded up to say 100 tons, the 16-inch 45s, then you're looking at 900 tons. So you're talking about 250 ton difference in displacement using the two different guns. And once more, that is because of, and that's just the guns. So you'd be talking probably, once you include for the bigger turrets, 500-600 plus tons more displacement, which with the North Carolina class still trying to fit to 35,000 ton limit, yeah, that's not going to work. Plus, you'd have to design and build a turret for them. Galdir Ioni asks, as the veteran YouTuber that you now are, oh boy, that I should get a badge for that, I think. What is the weirdest feedback you've got? The funniest and the most infuriating? The weirdest feedback I've got has been probably ones that are completely incomprehensible. Not as in, someone's just smashed their head into the keyboard, but people who have clearly got the capability to construct sentences in the English language, but have either gone completely off-piste with their replies or have just typed out words that do not go together. There's been some comments I've seen where I can look at it and go, I think you're trying to make a point, but the sentence you've put together is not comprehensible in any language known to mankind, even though it resembles an English language sentence, to the point that my brain starts to hurt trying to work out what you may have been trying to say. So that would be weirdest, along with, as I said, some people who go off on very bizarre rants about things. The funniest, I'll come back to that. The most infuriating, I think, would probably be the category that is essentially people who don't actually bother watching the video. And, if people have negative feedback one way or the other about a video, even if they make points that I think are wrong, as long as it's evident from their comment that they have actually watched the video and maybe are disagreeing with me, and maybe even if I think they're disagreeing with me in a rather silly way, that's still fine. The ones I find really irritating are the people who just come in and they post something that is clearly to do with a video topic, but they have very obviously just come to post that and have actually not spent the slightest moment watching the video, because they're usually posting stuff that the video has directly addressed. Or they're just throwing accusations out there. Like when I did the however many naval engineering disasters, the sort of worst designed warships, there was a comment on there that was like, oh yeah, here's Drac pointing out how bad everybody else's warships are and how brilliant the British warships are because he's incredibly biased towards the Royal Navy. And I was sitting there going, not only do I think the Royal Navy has, of all the navies represented in that video, the Royal Navy has, I think, the most entries, but also the Indefatigable class gets top billing as the worst. So, yeah. At that point, it's very, 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 very evident that the person has not only not watched the video, they haven't even bothered to check the chapter markers. At which point, yeah. I think the reason that infuriates me is because they're clearly intelligent enough to appreciate what the video is about generally, and they're intelligent enough to put together a coherent English sentence, and dumb enough to think they know what the video actually says without looking at it. At which point, that's what in my mind is aggressive stupidity. The funniest feedback I've got has I think, has been people trying to work out who I am and getting it wrong, or people who, I think, I don't know if it's funniest comment or funniest feedback. I think, the funniest comments have been people who've they've taken some of the jokes and sarcasm in the video and run with it, and made up little songs and rhymes and so forth. With that I find very, very amusing, and I quite like that. The funniest feedback I've probably got has, I think probably the funniest sets of feedback I've seen has been when something's gone wrong in the video and multiple people then either email or comment telling me how I could have fixed the thing that went wrong, or what the problem might be that went wrong. Not because I find their attempts to help funny. That's actually, I really appreciate that they're trying to help. The funny thing is that, you can have a really simple problem on the face of it, like there's some kind of weird static interfering with my microphone when I'm out on Olympia in New Jersey last year. But the number of possible reasons for it are, there's I'm looking at it going, wow, I'm surprised I wasn't barbecued by RF radiation, because apparently there was a lot of sources of different RF radiation on that river. So yeah, I think it's those things where it's a fairly simple bit of feedback, but the number of different items of feedback turn it into this rather daunting colossus of numerous factors that were working against me. The Crazy One asks, how do you think the night actions off Guadalcanal would have gone if the British were able to reinforce the US Navy? Well, I mean, it's the Australian Navy, but HMAS Canberra was present for First Savo. HMAS Australia would have been if Crutchley hadn't been recalled to discuss tactics. But if the British had been able to reinforce the US Navy off Guadalcanal, I mean, it's a little difficult to say. I mean, the immediate temptation is to say it would have gone a lot better, because the British had, at that point, a better idea than most US Navy officers how to use radar, and a lot of British ships had radar. But at the same time, when you look at a number of the night actions off Guadalcanal, you had various US ships who did have radar spotting something and signaling back, and the US commanders not doing anything with that information, or doing the wrong thing with that information. So having a British ship there also signaling back correct information, or instead, either or instead of, it's still down to the commander to actually do something with that. So it may not have made a huge amount of difference unless you had senior British officers present for whatever reason, who hopefully would have had night combat experience from the Mediterranean, who may then have been able to go, oh, okay, right, we're going to use this information immediately. That might have turned things around. But I have a great deal of difficulty imagining the US long-term subordinating their cruiser and destroyer formations off Guadalcanal to British officer's command. As I said, although Crutchley was theoretically in immediate command at First Savo, that's not a situation that repeats itself. Texas and LaShock asks, what warship wreck would you most like to see scanned and rendered similarly to what they recently did with Titanic? Yeah, I saw that. That was really cool. It would have to be a wreck that's mostly intact. I mean, it's tempting to say Bismarck, but Bismarck's kind of almost had that done already. There's not enough of Hood left, I think, to really justify it. And some of the other famous wrecks like Yamato and again, although they haven't done the full 3D scan thing, they've done kind of photogrammetry and used that to do models and sketches and so forth. I mean, I think I'd actually rather like to see how much of Johnston is left intact. Because I know they found it, and I know they've got pictures of the wreck, but unlike a lot of other wrecks where they've at least, I said, used either photogrammetry or artist sketches to represent what she looks like, I haven't seen any full representations of what either Johnston or Samuel B. Roberts actually looks like in full on the seabed. Maybe someone has done that and I just haven't seen it, but I think that would be my first choice at this stage. And then Jason Roth, the last current super chat, B1900 pilot, thank you very much, has said alternate Leyte Gulf, center force and southern force are swapped and reinforced. The former center force gets 4 B-65 type battle cruisers and Shinano completed as a battleship. The former southern force gets both Issei's and 4 Ibuki class cruisers. Right. Okay, so Southern Force swapping in to the centre, I think probably actually goes worse for them because you've got now 4 older, slower 14-inch ships, so they're going to have more issues trying to chase down the escort carriers instead of 2 Congos, Nagato and Yamato. And you've got 4 Ibukis, okay, nasty, big, heavy cruisers, but theoretically there were plenty of nasty, big, heavy cruisers in Center Force as well, plus a handful of other escorts, including Megami. So in that scenario, Center Force probably gets treated a lot more roughly. Taffy 3 actually can just probably get away unless they dispatched the heavy cruisers separate to the Issei's and Fusos. At which point, heroic last stands all round. The new Southern Force, which is now Yamato, Shinano, Nagato, 2 Congos, and 4 B-65s, plus all their various cruisers, etc., etc. That's a lot more of a problem because there's now a lot more destroyers, a lot more cruisers, plus 6 battle cruisers and 3 battleships, including 2 Yamatos. That's enough. They could potentially just bull rush their way through the US defenses in the area. I mean, they're going to take an absolute pounding from the fact there's so many PT boats and destroyers flying torpedoes at them, and of course the US fire control advantage at night with radar. But that was against 2 old battleships with a relatively minimal escort, not 3 battleships, including 2 super battleships and 6 battle cruisers, plus a much heavier escort. I think that level of force probably would actually make it into close contact with 7th Fleet, at which point it would depend very much on who's weathered the most hits going through. Because if Shinano and Yamato are relatively intact, and maybe the Congos have been the ones that have absorbed the hits, and they've got Nagato and some B-65s backing them up, at close range in a night action, that could be very, very brutal for 7th Fleet. They may even lose, especially if with that many long lances that the Japanese might put in the water. There wouldn't be a huge amount of the Japanese force to break through into the landing areas thereafter, and it would be an absolutely colossal battle. But they might just get elements breaking through or get a tactical victory. And of course, they're much further south, which means it's going to be much harder for Halsey's forces to come back and help, because they've got some extra distance to cover. Although, of course, come dawn, Taffy's 1 and 2 can try and launch air attacks. Green Sea ships pointing out, yeah, don't forget the tendency of Japanese admirals to run away in the face of certain victory. I think in a night action that might actually, it's going to be such a confused mess of an action. Probably no one's really going to know what on earth is going on. It's just going to be a case of shoot at anything that isn't friendly and see who's still alive in the morning. Right. So, that is all of the Patreon Drydock alternate history questions, with the exception of Salty Viking 10,022s, which I'm going to do separately, and Okage's very long Japanese-Dutch hybrid ship, which again I'm going to have to do in a separate thing. I'll write up both of those probably if I have some spare time in Australia. So, we are now in with you lot, taking questions from the live stream, trying to keep up. Gardener 42, what would have been the effect of the US Mark 14 torpedo working properly right from the start of hostilities? Quite large. Wouldn't have stopped the Japanese, wouldn't have stopped the fall of the Philippines, but would have made them pay a lot more for it, considering how many unsuccessful attacks were made. But, as I've said before with this kind of question, in order to completely comprehend it, I mean, even just as a first iteration, you'd have to look through all of the war reports for all of the submarines that sailed in pretty much the first year of the US involvement in the war, tabulate which Mark 14's attacks most likely hit or would have resulted in a hit had the detonator been working properly. Then you can approximate a sunk number of vessels, but even that's going to be inaccurate because, of course, if you have a few big victories, you're going to have everybody going, the Japanese are going to change things. So the more and more additional ships are sunk by the Mark 14, the more and more history diverges. But you can probably draw some patterns from it. Knight 6831 asks, at what point did it become apparent to the Royal Navy that its 13.5-inch armed ships had become a liability? It depends which ones, but essentially, well, the treaty compelled them to get rid of their last 13.5-inch ships once Nelson and Rodney were fully online anyway, and the London Treaty obviously coming up as well. I think the 13.5-inch armed battleships, at least with the Iron Dukes, technically weren't in and of themselves a liability up to the point that they were scrapped or decommissioned and turned into training vessels and so forth. Their main issue was that the Royal Navy now had 15-inch guns in most of its ships, 16-inch guns in a few, and then much older, less powerful 13.5-inch guns on their now oldest vessels, which meant 3 different sets of main battleship armament to try and produce shell-wise, which was a bit of a problem. Because, I mean, as long as, the US has things like Arkansas, Utah, Wyoming, Florida, etc., still in service, a 13.5-inch ship is better than that, and 10 13.5-inch guns is still more than enough to deter a Congo, even if you can't catch one. And Tiger is a relatively decent addition to the Royal Navy battle line, but once the battleships go, having one ship with 13.5-inch guns is now a liability. So as full liabilities, it's basically the end of the 1920s, but that's largely dictated by the treaties. Lego World War Build says, can you do a guide on Pole 3? And what ship would you want to captain? I would like to captain Bismarck. I wouldn't like to captain Bismarck because I would die 5 minutes into my second battle, as per history. But yeah, I can add Pole 3 to the list of ships to review. In terms of what ship I would want to captain, I've said before, I would want to captain an Age of Sail frigate. Or if I valued health concerns a little bit more, then I would want to probably be on something like Massachusetts or Alabama, because I'm sensible and I want to be able to see some action, but I also want to live. And historically, those two ships are very good candidates for staying alive on. Ramal, we are now in normal chat questions. Shadow49, was there a noticeable difference between nations when they started welding instead of using rivets for their ships? If you mean, was there a noticeable difference between various nations in terms of when they started using welding instead of rivets? Yes, there was. The US was one of the early adopters. The Royal Navy kind of began to phase welding in during the 1930s. Welding had a few stops and starts in the other navies. The Russians were still riveting merrily away in the 1940s. I should think Germany, Italy, and Japan, they did use welding in places, but yeah, basically the US was well ahead of everybody else when it came to welding, and everyone kind of followed like ducklings a few years after. Hello, Aries Lictor. I am mostly alright, albeit somewhat tired. Ramal asks, why did only a few of the Brooklyn-class cruisers have 5-inch 38 guns, twin gun mounts, whilst most of them didn't? And why didn't they fit all of them with 5-inch 38 mounts during the war? Because the Brooklyns were being built at the time that the 5-inch 38 was being developed. So the ships that were already too far advanced would just have to make do with the heavy AA fit they'd been designed with, but some of the later ones could be built with 5-inch 38s because there was a bit of spare displacement. As far as why didn't they fit them all with 5-inch 38s during the war, well, even the mighty US war industry does have its limits, and the heavy AA 5-inch 25s and so forth that the Brooklyns had, whilst it wasn't the latest and greatest, it was still all right. And there were 5-inch 38s in demand for a lot of other brand new ships, mostly by numerical standards, the destroyers, but also for cruisers and everything. So it was better in the US's view to prioritize building new ships armed with 5-inch 38s than delay brand new ships in order to divert their 5-inch 38s to older ships that had an okay heavy AA armament anyway. USS Grego says 4.7 is only 0.3 of an inch from 5-inch, so would it really be that hard to refit Royal Navy destroyers? And theoretically, no. I mean, as I said, in weight-wise, in fact, I suspect the 5-inch 38 gun might actually weigh a little bit less than the 4.7 because the 4.7 is quite a long barrel weapon on Royal Navy destroyers. The main issue is having to redo all of the shell hoists, etc., because it is, you know, a shell hoist that's designed to deal with fixed 4.7-inch ammo. You're going to have to rip it out and completely replace it for a 5-inch 38, which is dealing with two-part ammo that's also a little bit bigger. That's where most of the cost is probably going to lie, to be honest. And what are the 3 dual turrets on top of your shelf? Those are brass gun turrets that are made, the 2 on either side, so this one and that one, they are made from the brass from battleships of the First and Second World Wars. And the middle one is a 15-inch twin turret, which I think is also made from the brass of a battleship, but I can't remember offhand. I think also the ones on either side technically are also ink pots, whereas the center one is a kind of student study in exactly mimicking a gun turret. I know one of them offhand. I know one of them is one of the smaller gun turrets is from the brass from the Helgoland. Green Sea Ships says, you were oh so close on your Iowa visit. If you're planning to come back to California, any chance we can lure you into the world's ultimate museum ship, RMS Queen Mary, as she is open again? So in September, all being well, I am planning to come back to the States and visit a bunch of ships I have not visited before. Whether I'm going to start or end on the West Coast, I haven't decided yet, but I am going to be spending probably the better part of a week in San Francisco. So, possibly. Let me just check, where is RMS Queen Mary? Long Beach. That's helpful. Where's Long Beach? Long Beach is in the Los Angeles metropolitan area. Ooh. Well, I'm going to be in San Francisco, which is a fair way up the state. But the schedule is still a little bit in flux, so who knows? I might make it down, but I can't make any particular promises because, as it turns out, last time I was down in the southern part of California, San Francisco and LA and San Diego are quite far apart. Oh, where's the skip gone? Sim Crawford says, good morning. I haven't had the chance to watch your video on watches and clocks yet. Have you read the book Longitude? Yes. In fact, I read about 3 different books called Variants on Longitude as part of the research for that video. But if you mean the sort of the very famous one that got adapted into a series, yes, I did read that. But I also read another one published by the National Maritime Museum on it, and there was a third one on Longitude as well, somewhere over there, I think. So yes, I've read many books called Longitude on that subject. King Brock says, I remember there being mention of a ship shooting a torpedo out of the water. What was it, so I can do more research? It was a merchant ship in a convoy. Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you exactly which ship, but if you drop me an email or a Discord DM, I can grab the book that has that account in it and look it up for you and tell you exactly which ship and hopefully also which convoy. Mr. Serenity's End. What do you think is the best ironclad built before 1880? That's a difficult one because they all have various strengths and weaknesses. From a purely engineering perspective, I would go with HMS Inflexible because she's the first capital ship to be built taking advantage of Froude's research, which in turn means that she's able to actually go faster than some ships that, by rule of thumb, have a better hull form than her because she has a mathematically calculated hull form. But her main battery is, it's heavy, but it's not particularly good in terms of its rate of fire and accuracy. So I don't necessarily know that would be the best ironclad, period, prior to 1880. Then you could argue things like Devastation shows the way forward for pre-dreadnoughts, but she is very low freeboard. You could argue Gloire because she's for a while the only ironclad. You could argue Warrior because Warrior is much superior to Gloire and stays pretty much at the top of the ironclad pecking order for, longer than most other ironclads that claimed the title in that period, but still only a year or two. So yeah, I think, and that's before you get into things that, Magenta and Solferino, the double deckers, which I really like. I'm not necessarily sure they're the best, but I do like them. Yeah, it's very difficult to pick a single best ironclad in that period because everything is being obsoleted so quickly. Sean Quigley asks, considering the effect of on strategy of the Doolittle raid, what would using the super bombers B-15 and 19 immediately post Pearl Harbor to strike Tokyo have had on Japanese strategy? I don't know what a B-15 bomber is. Let me have a look. Okay, so it's big prototype. Oh, I think this was the one that... Was this the one that Rex's hangar covered recently? Maybe. Oh, no, that was it. The XB-19. That was the big one that Rex's hangar did recently. I mean, there's only one of each, so... but I suppose if you could send the single B-15 and the single B-19 to hit Tokyo, I mean, it might have scared them. It might have been... Yeah. I honestly don't know, because that's getting into the realm of air power. It would have been interesting. I mean, it'd be interesting to see if both of them actually survived the entire journey. I mean, it's tempting to say that you'd have a similar thing to what happened with the Doolittle raid, with the Japanese pulling back units for home defense. But at the same time, if you get two very visually distinct bombers and only two showing up, and I don't even know what their full range factors are. I mean, they can make it. Can they make it back? Will they make it back without being shot down? Where will they go? I don't think it would have as big an effect as the Doolittle raid, to be honest. But you know, that's getting into air power, which is not my wheelhouse. Joris Amalan asks, apparently the Germans borrowed Austro-Hungarian Skoda guns to blow up the Liège forts in August 1914. How good was Austrian big gun tech in World War I? Skoda was actually remarkably advanced for its time, bearing in mind that the Tegetthoffs launched with Skoda-designed triple turrets at a time when both, well, Germany, Britain, the US, and France were all sticking with twins for various reasons, and somewhat struggling, to be honest, to get the idea of a working triple wrapped up in their heads. Whereas Skoda went in and said, no, we're doing triple 12-inch. You know, now granted, the Russians then also did triple 12-inch, as did the Italians, but Skoda, I think, if I remember correctly, were the first to do it. So, yeah, in terms of Austrian or Austro-Hungarian big gun technology, Skoda were pushing the front lines. They were just as capable as Krupp or Vickers or anybody else. Kelly Bright, have you been keeping abreast of the misadventures of the Petrel in Scotland? I know it fell over recently, or a few weeks ago now. I don't know what's happened to it since, though. Then Ross M asks, what does HMS Safari's creepy crest depict? Well, I don't know. Let's have a look. It apparently depicts some kind of witch's cauldron bubbling over... Oh, no, he's being hung from a tripod over an all-seeing eye? Okay. That's... I have no idea what's going on with that. That's incredibly bizarre. Where is that? That's pendant numbers. Somewhere around here I've got a book on Royal Navy crests, which might explain this. Maybe I've got it. Alright, I'm just trying to see if I've got this book. Where has it gone? I think I've got this on online. Ship's badges or ship's crests? Heraldry in the Royal Navy, that's the one. No, I don't appear to have it on. So okay, so my Heraldry in the Royal Navy book has gone AWOL. I shall have to find it, but I genuinely have no idea what that could signify. Knight6831 says, would it be fair to say we have no idea what the Royal Navy's 1921 fleet modernisation plan would have been? Well, we have a little bit of an idea, but because we know they were building the G3s and the N3s, or they were building the G3s and planning to build the N3s, we know pretty much from the immediate post-war period what they were going to get rid of anyway, even without the treaties, which basically is anything with a 12-inch gun. So the fleet was going to consolidate around 13.5 and 15-inch ships, but that was only going to be temporary while they got 16 and 18-inch ships off the ground. And then, if I recall correctly, the 16 and 18-inch ships would have meant a wholesale retirement of the 13.5-inch, and so you would have just had the 15-inch upward fleet. But it was, it was sketched out, but not there wasn't a full, like, on X date we will decommission Y ship all the way up to the Queen Elizabeths. Michael Hammond asks, in your opinion, what was a piece of naval technology that was developed between 1850 to 1950 that may have been very successful, but was abandoned before its potential was realized? Abandoned before its potential was realized. I mean, theoretically, the pneumatic guns as used by USS Vesuvius, because technically speaking, the technology, all the components that would have allowed them to solve issues like to a certain degree range and specifically accuracy in terms of pressure firing at range, those would mostly be solved later on, but by that point the actual gun technology had fallen out of use in the navies. So I would say that yeah, it may have been successful, not as a replacement for chemical propellant based guns, but it may have been successful as an alternative for certain particular uses like shore bombardment and so forth. Donald Robertson asks, any plans for a South America trip or trips? it's on the horizon of the very long-term horizon as a distant plan. And the thing is, there are some museum ships in South America, but not a lot. There tends to be one or two, especially for the time period that the channel covers, there tends to be one or two but per nation and spread out quite considerably. Plus, as half British, half Bolivian, my survival time in Argentina would probably be measured in minutes. So you're talking about basically Peru, Chile, maybe Brazil. And that would be quite expensive, because that would be, it's expensive and long distance to get to South America in the first place. And there'd be quite a lot of expense for the fairly long distance internal flights. I think if I was going to make a South America trip, I would probably anchor it around a trip to Bolivia to see my family, my extended family, and to probably shoot the documentary series on the history of the Incas and the conquest by the conquistadors, which I've had on the back burner in my mind for quite a while, because then that would be funded by me for my purposes as kind of my holiday with Mrs. Track. And then it would be considerably easier from a channel perspective to append a few internal flights to, Huascar, etc., while I'm there, rather than trying to justify from a channel perspective paying for an entire trip down to South America. DKS, were Hood's older fire control systems responsible for the lack of hits on Bismarck? Certainly didn't help. Hood, this is the thing with Hood, she launched with some of the world's latest and greatest fire control systems when she entered service, but 2 decades later they were somewhat behind the times and they hadn't really been updated all that much. So yeah, if Hood had had a modern Admiralty fire control table, for instance, she may well have scored some hits on something before she sank. 9681 pointing out, Hood was firing at Prince Eugen for a bit, but, that's why I said she might have hit something. Not necessarily Bismarck, but something. They did figure out what the problem was. They'd figured out they were shooting at the wrong target eventually, but, who knows? Connor Shannon asks, what's your favourite maritime ghost story - ship? Might sound a bit, what's the term? A bit low-hanging fruit, I guess. But the Flying Dutchman, mostly because there's so many variations on it. There's no established canon, I guess. There's a few... Sorry, I'm going to switch that to mute. Because of the various conflicting stories about the Flying Dutchman and the exact origins of it, I quite like it because you can kind of weave together your own narrative a bit. Peter Smith says, if you had a chance to remake any of the war films, which one would it be? Possibly controversially, if I'm remaking one, I wouldn't remake a naval one. I would actually remake Battle of Britain. Not to say I don't like Battle of Britain. It is a classic that stands on its own merits, but given the sheer scope of the film and what you could do these days if you had a well-funded, well-directed crew with mixing real-life aircraft with CGI, I would probably redo Battle of Britain. Grey Ghost asks, during the Battle of Santa Cruz, did the helmsman manage to exceed Enterprise's spec turning radius, as a reference to Drydock 137? I don't know. The reports from the battle aren't really all that much big on specifying turn radii and distances. I suppose if you went back and looked at the video that exists, you could maybe make some rough calculations to work out if Enterprise was in fact going in an even tighter circle than she theoretically is, at least on paper, is capable of doing. But I rather suspect she probably wasn't, more from the fact that the rudder will only go over so far. So there are certain physical limits to it. But who knows, maybe there are some quite clear pictures of the wake of the ship in the video of Enterprise at Santa Cruz. So someone could calculate what the turn radius was and compare that to what she historically is supposed to have been capable of. Onyx 40 says, what would have happened if the British Eastern Fleet had engaged with the Japanese fleet at Leyte Gulf as a combined task force, the fleet with mostly carriers and destroyers? It depends on what the strength of the British Eastern Fleet would have been at the time. Again, I mean, because the British Eastern Fleet did have a fair number of battleships with it. It had a fair number of carriers and destroyers in it, but let's see, Battle of Leyte Gulf. Check the date. So Battle of Leyte Gulf is October 44. That's not helpful. Right, there we go. So, in October 1944, you've got HMS Howe. Let's go. Okay, so HMS Howe is present in October 44. So is Queen Elizabeth. So modernized Queen Elizabeth. No. Richelieu is there until October 44. Let me just double check when she leaves. Okay, so Richelieu is not. She's basically on her way back to get her machinery fixed. So far we've got Howe and Queen Elizabeth. Valiant's gone. Warspite is gone, and Royal Sovereign is gone. Renown is there though. So we've got Renown, Queen Elizabeth, and Howe. So there are 3 battleships there. Well, 2 battleships and a battle cruiser. Where the heck's that question gone? Everything's just skipped. There we go. Okay. So yeah, Leyte Gulf. I mean, they've all got radar, and Queen Elizabeth, Howe, and Renown can easily deal with Southern Force. Centre Force, I wouldn't take Howe, Queen Elizabeth, and Renown up against the entirety of Kurita's force, but then theoretically, if the Eastern Fleet is engaging the Japanese at Leyte Gulf, you're going to have destroyers and escort carriers present instead in the centre. So, and Azawa's force north is all decoys, so the British carriers would make a fair killing there. So yeah, it'd be similar, maybe a bit more closely fought in the south though, and it would take longer to destroy Azau's force because the British carriers would have fewer planes. Cameron, U505 at the MSI in Chicago on your September trip. Possibly working on it. Basically, at the moment, obviously I'm concentrating on the trip to Australia, but if I get the videos for Australia completed in good time before I have to leave, then I'll be messaging various ships for the September trip before I leave, and if I don't, then I'll be messaging them when I get back. Woody Carlisle, are you going to see CSS Hunley? Depends where it is, but maybe. The Green Sea Ship says, "Oh, you're almost in walking distance when you're aboard Iowa." Yeah, that was a very, very busy trip last year. Strix Aluko asks, would a destroyer based around the 105mm gun, Akizuki style, be better for the Kriegsmarine compared to what they actually built? Most likely. I mean, the Kriegsmarine did have some decent 105 and twin 105mm mounts. So instead of overburdening their ships with 128mm, later on 128s and even larger guns, 5.9-inch guns, etc., that just single purpose and don't really work particularly brilliantly, you could get, I think, having 4 twin 105s, or maybe even 5 twin 105s on the sides of the German ships. Yeah, individually the shells might hit slightly less hard, but A, it gives you true dual purpose, and B, if you're chucking 8 to 10 barrels downrange at the rate of fire that the 105 can manage, that's probably actually going to work out better for you in a destroyer engagement than occasionally firing off a 5.9, assuming the sea is nice and calm. Ramal asks, can you shed light on your schedule for overseas trips this year? Which countries, when, and how long? So the one that's coming up is the Australian one, which I've announced in the video that I released about the Australia trip already. So just calling up that. That is, I'm leaving on the 4th of June, coming back on the 22nd, and then heading off almost immediately to Tankfest. So that's basically June spoken for. In late July or early August, I'm hoping to pop over to Hungary. There's a couple of bits and pieces I want to pick up there. That Litha, I've already been on the monitor, but there are a few other pieces for me to see there. That's mostly, there's going to be like half holiday for me and Mrs. Drack, and half research trip. And then in September, I'm doing what's probably going to be a 2.5 to 3 week tour of the US. So that's going to be basically an arc of San Francisco up to Bremerton, across the north, going to the Hinza conference towards the end of September, and then wrapping up on the East Coast. I'm also trying to fit in a visit back to Patriots Point to see Laffy if I can, but I'm still working on finalising the schedule. But basically, early-ish, mid and late September, maybe even early October, that kind of time period, there'll be a US trip, because US trips are fantastically less expensive than Australian trips. That's all I've got on my slate at the moment for this year. That's left. I may try and do a couple of day trips over to Europe, to somewhere like Denmark, to see Jylland, etc. But that's going to be basically, does EasyJet have like a 20 quid return ticket? At which point it would actually be cheaper to go to. This is the weird thing, if you get a decent deal with something like EasyJet, you can actually go to Denmark or Sweden or France or Italy cheaper than it actually costs you to go into central London. And I live on the edge of London. Yeah, go figure. Woody Carlisle, have you been or are you going to see CSS Hunley? I haven't been to see Hunley. I might this year, maybe, who knows. Sean Quigley says, wait a minute, didn't Mythbusters prove that bullets broke up striking the surface of the water? They proved that high velocity, relatively small bullets break up striking the surface of the water. Low velocity, small caliber ammunition doesn't, and the game changes somewhat when you're talking about much, much larger projectiles like you normally deal with in naval combat. Nick Trains 22, what is that ship battle in the painting? That is the Battle of Quiberon Bay. You'll be seeing that painting in a lot more detail when I finally get around to doing a video on the Battle of Quiberon Bay. Rural Preparedness Project, have you read the Destroyermen series? No, I have not. As I've said before, naval fiction, unfortunately these days, naval fiction is actually something I don't read all that much because naval fact is both my hobby and my job. But when I'm not doing research, etc., or just reading naval history because I like reading naval history, I do have to occasionally do something else. Walter Broad US, has your bookshelf ever engaged enemies in action? Not yet. I mean, this whole setup is, relatively speaking, new. It's about a year old now, I think. Green Sea Ship says Rex just did the XB15 this weekend. I shall have to look it up. I think that's on my watch later list, actually. Let me just double check. I better make sure. Well, it's on my watch later list now anyway. I know I watched the XB19 one. Vicky asks, Center Force versus 7th Fleet Standards, except Kurita also has the ships historically lost at Sibayan Sea, so a couple of cruisers and Musashi, and all the historically 14-inch arm standards have been refitted with 8 16-inch guns. Who wins? So you're talking about 6 battleships with 8 16-inch guns versus Nagato, Yamato, Musashi, 2 Congos, and a bunch of cruisers. I mean, theoretically, given that most of them are slightly older ships, the Nagato would be a loose one-on-one for one of those ships. The Congos are at a disadvantage. So let's say 2 Congos is equivalent to one of the others, which then leaves the Yamatos going 2v4, which is actually what the Yamatos are designed to do. So that's actually going to be a very close match, I think. I think that's pretty much going to be dependent on how well do the Yamatos actually fare in 2v1 combat as opposed to how they should fare on paper. If they do as well as they should do on paper, then the Japanese might get away with it, although I rather suspect the Yamato and Musashi will probably be the only battleships left in any kind of significant operational condition. But who knows? Sean Riley, are we on to chat questions? Yes, we are. Rob Smith pointing out the B-17 had a range of the B-19 had a range of 5,000 miles, just about enough to get to Tokyo from Pearl Harbor, but not enough to get home. Well, yeah, I mean, to be honest, if it's right after Pearl Harbor, they might actually, tell it to, I guess, maybe divert to the Philippines on its way back, which at that point it probably gets caught on the ground, but that sucks. Donald Robertson says the new HMS Caroline in Belfast, i.e. the renovated, the revamp, is a real treat. Have you any plans to visit? Yes, I do want to visit Caroline. I just need to get in contact with them and sort it all out. Vicky asks, didn't the Nevadas have triples just after the Tegethoffs? Pretty sure. I mean, it depends how you define just after, because the Tegethoffs, the first Tegethoffs are laid down in 1910, which means their armament design has to be sorted out in 1909. And the Nevadas are laid down in 1912. So you're talking about a gap of 2 to 3 years, which, okay, is not a lot, generally speaking, but in the Dreadnought arms race, that is quite a lot. In the Dreadnought arms race, like a year or two is a fair bit of time. It's a generation of ship design. Cameron, thank you very much. It's unfortunately Mrs. Drack is staying here for the Australian trip, partly because of the colossally stupid expense of it all, and partly also because she has to look after Floppy the dog, because he's still only 3.5 months old. So yeah, we can't really leave him for a month. But Floppy will be taken on an internal holiday in the UK by Mrs. Drack, so he will also get to experience, not overseas, but out of South London travel. One of these days Floppy will make it on screen, but the thing is, the library here is upstairs, and Floppy, being a deerhound, does not do stairs, which means I'd have to carry him, and he's probably pushing 16, 17 kilos now, which is easy enough to carry, but he's quite a big doggo. Again, could be done, but if I was going to show him off, especially with a camera angle, I'd have to go downstairs, pick him up, bring him up here, show him to everyone. He'd probably look around very bemused and wondering what the hell was going on. And then I'd have to take him back downstairs and hope he didn't jump, because he might hurt himself. So I think if Floppy's going to deploy on camera at some point anytime soon, it's probably going to be in a video that I'm filming outside or somewhere downstairs for some reason. Maybe if I do another food cooking one, he'll definitely be there observing that. How are we doing? It's 10 to 11. Okay, we've been going for 2 hours and 50 minutes, so yeah, we've got a little bit more time to go, I think. Oh, I am out of drink. Gary Jordan, are you ever going to cover the US Coast Guard? Eventually. I mean, the Coast Guard, especially in its origins, was somewhat more militaristic than it is today. So, yeah, Coast Guard vessels will make it in eventually. Nick Trains 22, what would be your optimum pre-Dreadnought battleship design? Very much depends on the time period, because pre-Dreadnoughts include things like the Dantons and the Lord Nelsons, semi-Dreadnoughts, and goes back all the way to things like the Majestics. If you want to go with an optimum classic pre-Dreadnought, there's quite a lot that follow the basic paradigm of, somewhere between 10 to 12 inches of Krupp armour, 18 to 19 knot top speed, 4 12-inch guns in 2 twin turrets, and, a dozen to 18 6-inch guns as secondaries. And when you say that, it's like, that's a fairly easy optimum pre-Dreadnought battleship design to rattle off. It's tempting, if you're looking at it from a Royal Navy perspective, to go, well, maybe we make those secondary 7.5s, or the Germans make them 8.2, 8.3. The Americans had some 7-inch and some 8-inch on their pre-Dreadnoughts. But in my mind, as soon as you start doing that, although people did do that, it starts to edge a little bit more into the semi-Dreadnought era. So you have to kind of make do with the 6-inch to be pure classic Dreadnought, even though you can point to like half a dozen glasses that don't in the classic pre-Dreadnought era. Sean Riley says, what are your opinions of Admiral McNorris, commander at the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands? He did exceptionally well given the circumstances he was put in, and he managed to combine pretty good tactical conduct, again in the face of a technically superior force, with a fair bit of luck, which makes him that's one of the best things to have in a naval commander is they're lucky. Excuse me. Salt Lake City did get a little bit bashed around, but considering what should on paper have happened, he managed to pull off something that was a lot better than what any kind of reasonable simulation would suggest he would be capable of doing. Nariko asks, why did only Victorious get an angled deck? And was FDG, I guess that's Friedrich de Grosser, an answer to Iowa? Friedrich de Grosser as exists in World of Warships did not really exist as a serious proposal in German naval circles. H-39, which is essentially a slightly bigger 16-inch armed Bismarck, roughly, is basically the last serious German consideration for battleships. They were looking at H-40, depending on how people title it, H-40-41, maybe, kind of. And there's some 16.5-inch guns that were looked at as well. But when you get sort of H-40 up to H-42, you're now entering the realms of, this is a conceptual sketch for what might follow H-39, and anything beyond that is not even conceptual, it's more back of a napkin. But why did only Victorious get an angled flight deck out of the Illustriouses? Because she's the only one that's left by the time they refit her, and for frankly dumb reasons, it's decided that of the surviving ships, the surviving Royal Navy carrier fleet, they're going to take the oldest and least useful vessel and try and make that into an angled flight deck carrier first, despite the fact it's also the least practical to do. And they end up basically blowing the entire budget and more for full refits for the entire carrier fleet, just trying to do Victorious. So no one else gets significant upgrades. Although Eagle and Ark Royal do have a degree of angled flight deck already, thanks to earlier refits. Someone in Texas says, would it be possible to make an aircraft carrier out of wood? Yes. In theory, depends what time period, but a World War I wooden aircraft carrier is theoretically possible. The aircraft are light enough. Once you get much beyond that, I wouldn't. Okay, that's... BR Class 47 says, in one of the Azure Lane animes, there's some lines which are said mostly to annoy Karga. They say her I think it means they say her conversion used parts from her half-sister Amagi. This is left ambiguous in the anime. Is there truth to this, or is it all tale to annoy Karga? I mean, resources set aside for the conversion of Amagi were used in the conversion of Karga, because, of course, Karga was never supposed to be converted. Karga was supposed to be basically scrapped alongside Tosa, and Amagi and Akagi were supposed to be the carrier conversions, but the Great Kanto earthquake wrecked the hull of Amagi, which meant Akagi got converted, Karga got a reprieve, albeit that it wasn't like Amagi was 3/4 of the way through conversion into a carrier when her hull was wrecked. So materials earmarked for the carrier conversion would have gone to Karga, but it's not like You know, it's not like Amagi had an island and a flight deck that were lifted wholesale and stuck on cargo. She was pretty much converted to her own unique design. Random space junk. Did anyone ever look into airdropping torpedo boats from a Zeppelin, or using a number of Zeppelins strapped together to airlift something like a destroyer? The latter, no, because it's just, yeah, it's not going to work. I mean, in theory, you could get the lifting capacity with enough Zeppelins, but putting that many Zeppelins so close together, you're going to end up with a lot of fireballs. Did they look at airdropping torpedo boats from a Zeppelin? Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I suppose they could be tried, but how would you get them back? Would be the main question. Controlling a Zeppelin near ground level is quite difficult. So, I mean, yeah, I don't think anyone seriously looked into it, but in theory, you might be able, if you're talking about like coastal motorboat type, i.e., slightly glorified powerboats with a torpedo or two strapped to it, yeah, you probably could drop a few of them from a Zeppelin. Wouldn't like to be on them, but you could. I just don't know how you'd get the crew back, because, hovering at 50, 100 feet with a Zeppelin with a rope ladder over rough seas trying to get people to climb on it. Yeah, that. I don't think that's really going to work that much. Sean quickly says the Clementine the cat is a little bit dubious of the fluffy research assistant. Oh well. Someone in Texas says, as I live an hour from Battleship Texas, I'm wondering if you are going to visit when she gets out of Drydock. And if so, would you do a meet and greet or something like that? If I can, I would love to go back to Battleship Texas when she's getting out of Drydock, whenever that happens to be. Would I do a meet and greet or something like that? If the guys who run Battleship Texas would be happy to do that, then I would be happy to do so. But I would point out that, if I'm going to go to see Battleship Texas get back in the water, she should be the centerpiece. So maybe I'd go out there and maybe do a meet and greet the day before or the day after. But I think the main event of her going in the water should be all about her and the hard work the Battleship Texas Foundation have done to get her there. The Judge YT asks, what if USS Midway 1945 has a final countdown moment and has to defend her namesake island? How does the fight versus the Japanese Navy go if she is the only carrier but has her escort? Oh, that's an interesting one. I mean, the thing is that the US has 3 carriers at Midway, but Hornet you can basically write off because all our planes go wandering off to nowhere. 1945 Midway has some very, very advanced aircraft with some very advanced capabilities and has quite a few of them. Now, she can't launch quite as many aircraft as Yorktown and Enterprise combined, but given that it's 1945, she knows how the historical Battle of Midway goes, and she can afford to put fighter escort with her torpedo bombers, and those torpedo bombers are going to be far less vulnerable than the Devastators anyway, because at that point they're going to be lofting torpedoes from relatively high and relatively fast. So, how does it fight? I think Midway 1945, once she's fully worked up, she can probably pull off killing the Kirubutai. It would be a little bit of a... I mean, I think she'll probably, kill Akagi and Kaga first, and then recover back to rearm, refuel, and then go after Hiryu and Soryu. So she might be able to get she might be able to pull it off, but she'll be running herself a little bit ragged to do it all alone. And the fact her aircraft have, longer ranges and higher capability means that she can be out of the way, and she can also have a small cap with radar direction to take out Japanese scout aircraft. So hopefully they won't find out where she is and end up with her being counter-striked. Awen Dill asks, if Roosevelt had actually listened to Admiral Richardson and kept the ships on the west coast, in your opinion, what are the chances of Japan attacking the US at all? They do have to go after the Philippines for reasons I've discussed several times before. So, the Philippines is technically US territory, so they would be attacking there. Would they go after Pearl Harbor if there are no capital ships in there? Maybe. They wouldn't be going after the capital ships because they're physically not present, but they could try and wreck up the harbour facilities to deny them to the US, because if they can deny the US the use of Pearl Harbor, then that, although it doesn't stop the US having a battle fleet, it does make that battle fleet getting over to interfere considerably more risky. So they could do it. I don't know if they necessarily would, though. They might just, try and revert to plan A and bait the US into coming to them and hitting them mid-Pacific. Knight 6831 says, how did a single Mark 14 torpedo cause the IJN Minazuki to break up and sink? That sounds like a destroyer. Let's just double check to confirm. Yes, it was. Well, yeah, to be fair, it's a Mutsuki class destroyer. Most destroyers fold into and sink when they're hit by a torpedo. And a Mutsuki class is a relatively small by World War II standards destroyer. So, yeah, if she's hit by a Mark 14 that actually works, given the Mark 14 did have a relatively nice warhead, it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest that managed to take her out. Right, so it's now 11:05. I can feel my voice starting to go, and I'm a little bit tired. So I'm going to go through. I'm going to try and speed run through some of the questions from the live chat and try and catch up with where it is now. So apologies, but I physically can't answer all the questions right this instant. But I am going to try and do some impromptu live streams from Australia. Just what it said, we're going to have to see what timing and phone signal are like. But let's see where we go. Casper T. Hetbrink says, I know you've mentioned something about the Royal Navy having Malta class instead of other different classes of carrier. In which video did you answer this? It's in one of the dry docks. Offhand, I couldn't tell you, but I know it's in one of the dry docks, possibly also in one of the live streams. I know I definitely answered it in a regular recorded dry dock at one point. Yeah, I'd have. I need to update. I need to upload the newer copy of the Excel spreadsheet that has all the questions. So for the dry docks, so people can have a look at that. If I upload that to the website, then you should be able to track it down that way. But yeah, it's going to be in one of the dry docks, which I know isn't very helpful, but that's all I can remember. I don't know which number it was now. Tiberius 49. Are there 20th century examples of capital ships, not submarines, being captured by an enemy before they could be scuttled? Capital ships. I mean, there's some marginal cases. So a few of the German capital ships at Scapa Flow were able to be run aground instead of sinking, which, I mean, they were already being scuttled, but they were not successful in their scuttling completely. Technically speaking, the Japanese got a hold of Hornet before they realized she was hopelessly gone and finished her off with torpedoes. Um, 20th century, Battle of Tsushima. There were quite a number of capital ships that surrendered instead of being scuttled on the Russian side of things. World War I and World War II, there weren't any capital ships that were outright captured instead of being scuttled on the high seas, though. So I think those, in terms of full-on capital ships in at-sea conditions, that's probably about the only examples you're going to get. William Potts says, I found Norman Freeman's battleships for $12, lucky you, through A Books, as well as his US cruisers. What next that won't break the bank? Keep an eye out on... I mean, Norman Freeman does British and US ships, so I'd say keep an eye out on A Books for, versions of his books that are being sold for well under price. And also... have a look at the book recommendations playlist that I've got, because I try to suggest decent books that are, good starter books, and where possible are available at a decent price. And even for the ones that are slightly more expensive, at least you've got an idea of what to look for, which you can then look out for and see if someone's selling a second-hand copy. Knight 6831, why did the Royal Navy end up with a mixture of 39 12-inch armed ships, 5 10-inch armed ships, and 8 13.5-inch armed ships for its pre-dreadnoughts and semi-dreadnoughts? So this is basically the 13.5-inch guns that's on the Royal Sovereigns are the last gasp of the older gun technology. They switch over to the 12-inch with the Majestics because that is longer barrel, better propellant, better projectile weaponry. And that becomes the standard for Royal Navy pre-dreadnoughts. So yeah, the Royal Sovereigns are the sort of the last years, or last centuries, literally, gun technology. The Royal Navy prefers the 12-inch, but they get the 10-inch through a mixture of building a handful of second-class battleships deliberately, and also inheriting a few from having negotiated an end to the first South American battleship race. And then there's some ships under construction, so they have to then buy them. That's where the 10-inch ships come from. Oh, excuse me. Michael Kovacic asks, how realistic was a war between the US and Britain and Japan in the interwar period? It depends which historians you read. There were certainly tensions and flashpoints where things could have gone badly, but broadly, international tensions between those three didn't get quite high enough that there was a serious risk of war. 5 minutes to midnight style stuff. But it is realistic to posit that things could have gone slightly differently, and that might have led to 2 or 3 years of escalation, which might then have led to war. Naval Policy Between the Wars is a 2-volume series by, I think it's by Roskill, back up there. Though that covers a lot of the political maneuverings, I would say they're probably the 2 best books to get a foundation as to how likely you might make an evaluation of it. Grey Ghost says, from Drydock 77, did the gunner in HMS Malaya eat his birthday cake after all was settled and done? No, in the end, because it was on a French warship, and the negotiations and then the eventual disarmament of the French ships took far too long. Although he did maintain some relatively cordial relations with some of the French sailors, by the time they were able to actually meet up and communicate again, it was, that cake would have long ago been stale. Apparently I have a massive splinter in my foot that I didn't notice. That's annoying. Beyond AGS says, someday can you do a video about the first autoloader on warships? Sure, at some point. R. Khan says, can you tell me about the electronic jamming equipment the US Navy used to stop Fritz X missiles off the coast of Italy? Not offhand. I do have a book over there on radar and other electronic warfare developments in World War II that I know actually has quite a detailed description of the jamming equipment. But offhand, I couldn't tell you that much about it other than it existed and was based off of some rather impromptu jammers that had been put together by the Allies relatively quickly upon the advent of things like HS-239, which is actually what the jammers work for. Fritz X obviously going over to being wire guided as a response, but it kind of worked against where there were radio controlled German munitions, they worked. Michael Kovacic pointing out, for the German destroyer question, I did the math once and you can get 4 twin 4105s and a quad torpedo launcher for the same weight. Well, yeah, there you go then. Galdiona says, London is a scam. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I mean, just not even in the time I've been alive, but just in the time I've been a member of the active workforce, I've seen the price of travel into London pretty much double. And the service is not worth double the money. The service quality has not gone up by a factor of 2. Nosdormu 89. What was the oldest combatant to engage the enemy during both world wars respectively, and how well did they equip themselves? That's a good question. Let's see. Oldest combatant during World War One. I mean, if you exclude merchant raiders and so forth, the oldest combatants that I can think of from the major navies would have been protected and armoured cruisers from the late 1880s, early 1890s. But they were all used on very second line roles. World War II, the destroyer, even the V&Ws and the Wicks and Clemsons are late World War One. Queries and R's, Dorian and Cavors, Duilios, Arkansas. There's no crew. The C class. There's some C class left. I have a feeling it was. I have a feeling you're probably looking at Arkansas or Duilio, or Cavor more properly, I think, as the oldest combatants in World War II of any significant size. I think that all the destroyers are newer than them, and even the remaining C class are newer than them as well. So, yeah, at which point, I mean, they did fairly well for themselves, actually, considering their age. Ramal says, no Japan trip in the future. Japan is also on the long-distance radar, but I have no idea what the cost of a Japan trip would be. And, yeah, establishing exactly what to visit in Japan, it would be another interesting, because there's obvious stuff like Kure and Yamato and Mikasa, but as we've been finding with Australia, there tends to be an awful lot more maritime history in what for me is a long-distance overseas place than you initially think. Mark Bass, are you going to visit Blueback in Portland and Turner Joy in Bremerton? Definitely in Bremerton. I don't know about Portland. Ice Hunter asks, I got a question about French quad turrets. I've seen a picture of the battleship Richelieu's turrets with guns at independent elevation, but when firing, two barrels are at the same elevation. Probably because both barrels were firing at the same target, so they probably elevated them to the same degree. I would imagine that's why that is going on. Dr. Clark says, has it got redder since I was here earlier? No, that's just the red background, but it may be contrasting more because I put the light on. In fact, since we're probably winding down soon, because I can feel my voice beginning to go, and I've got to do a lot of recording tomorrow. Computer, library off.
Okay.
Action stations. BR Class 47 says, I went to HMS Caroline last month. She's very good to visit. There's a fair number of repeated questions there. Frank Barnwell says, when Floppy gets into a chewing state, train him away from the books. Yeah, well, Floppy won't get into the library unsupervised, and as I said, as a deerhound, he probably won't come up here much at all, because deerhounds don't deal well with stairs. Marcus Agrippa, who names the Royal Navy ships? Technically speaking, there is a committee that's supposed to suggest names, which then goes via the government, then goes via now the king, who gives final approval. But that's how it's supposed to work anyway. Vicky saying we need a video on the Battle of the Comoros Islands. I'm not disagreeing. Right, okay, so I think I'm going to do the last 5 questions, I think. And then I'm going to wrap it up. Okay. Smiling Nid asking, what about Greek ships as the oldest? Did none of them getting engagements? Well, Georgia Savarov was actually relatively speaking new in World War One, and although she was around in World War Two, as far as I'm aware, she didn't get involved in any major fights. She spent most of the time on Indian Ocean convoy escort work. And I think Joris Amelan's, I think Lytha was well and truly out of service by World War Two. Texas Analyst says, I'm disappointed it didn't do the LCAR's commuter chirp. No, unfortunately, the Alexa things don't. But my mobile phone, on the other hand, my mobile phone, if I can persuade it to, there you go. My mobile phone is, in fact, Elcar's. Awindel asks, why do the Germans consider their ships according to the gender of their names and not simply as she, as the British did? I'm not entirely sure that that's a thing. Bismarck being referred to as he seems to stem entirely from one particularly political-patriotic speech given in the run-up to her maiden voyage. I haven't done a huge amount of research into the etymology of German gendered ship names, but where I do see references to them, most of the time the Germans seem to have just stuck with calling their ships she, even if the name is male, which it seems to be par for the course for most people. But I'm not going to swear to that because, as I say, I haven't looked into it in in sort of a lot of detail. Right, so the last couple of questions. Nick Trains 22 says, how long is your to-do list nowadays? Put it this way. I plotted out all the Wednesday videos I can plan, i.e. the non-Patreon voted ones, for the rest of the year about 2 months ago. And between various bits I've had to insert since then due to interviews and such coming off and certain things that have to be timed, I think my Wednesday video list that's just I'm definitely doing these videos in sequence is already extended to about halfway into next year, and the list of topics to cover has gone. I think Wednesday videos, there's a list of topics that theoretically would last me for the next 4 or 5 years easily, and that's if I just don't think of it more. And I'm always getting new books and so forth, which are just adding to my list of things to consider. Mark Bass says, I recommend the Keyport Undersea Warfare Museum when you visit Bremerton. That one definitely is on my list to see. Okay. I'll do 2 more questions. BR Class 47. Did the United Kingdom, excluding the Courageous class, etc., draw up any designs for ships like the Alaska class, i.e. large, heavily gunned cruisers? Yes, but not in any great detail, and for the most part they were armed with 9.2-inch weapons in the late 1930s. But yeah, nothing particularly fantastic compared to an Alaska class. They were more big cruisers as opposed to Alaska, which sits right on the boundary line between battle cruiser and very, very large super cruiser. Paul Cooper, hey, fellow Kingston alumni here. Yeah, well done. I wonder which course you did. Yeah, so we're both graduates of Kingston University. I recently went on a fun trip around the museum ships of California. My favourite was the Jeremiah O'Brien as the boilers were lit. That is a ship I definitely want to get on. Texian Rebel, with the lighting, I can't help but expect Duel of the Fates to start playing. I do have several lightsabers downstairs. Maybe I'll bring one to the next live stream. Paul Cooper, mechanical engineering. Fellow engineer. Although I did civil, so I think as another mechanical engineer I know says, mechanical engineers like to describe civil engineers as the people who build the targets for the things the mechanical engineers build. So, hey, it's always fun and games. Right, so with that, I think I'm probably going to wrap it up there. Mark Jonix asking, could there ever be a Watu class destroyer? They need some recognition. I don't think a Watu class is going to work, but I think certainly a destroyer class named after some of the Watu staff, the women who basically helped beat the U-boats, and some of the other Wrens, definitely could be a thing. And Colton Yancey asking, have you done a video on ship-based medical care across the channel's cover timeframe? No, but I know someone that I could speak to. And then Sean Quigley saying, have you considered opening an actually opening a naval history company with employees, etc.? I'd love to, but I'd need YouTube to be paying me an awful lot more than it does at the moment, especially considering that, as you've probably seen from a number of other content creators on YouTube, the CPM, RPM, i.e. YouTube ad revenue has cratered in the last year or so. But nonetheless, we shall see, and hope to see everyone around some other video. Computer library on.
Okay.
And I will switch off the... got everyone, that's it. Thanks very much everyone for coming to listen, and see you again in another video at some point.